She scrubbed his floors on her hands and knees for 3 years, and Henry Sullivan never once looked past the apron. But the morning he found the letter hidden beneath the floorboard of her room, ink-stained, dated 3 years back, signed with a name that matched the deed to the land his father had stolen, everything he thought he knew about his quiet, faithful housekeeper collapsed like a rotted fence post in a spring flood. She hadn't come to clean his house. She'd come to take it back. If that truth hit you somewhere deep, you already know this story isn't about a housekeeper. Subscribe to our channel, watch this all the way through, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The letter was not supposed to be found. Margaret Holt had lived inside the careful arithmetic of survival long enough to know that secrets had weight, physical measurable weight, and that the heavier a secret sat, the more important it became to press it flat, fold it small, and tuck it somewhere unreachable. She had done exactly that. 3 years of doing it. 3 years of moving through Henry Sullivan's house like a woman who had nothing more on her mind than whether the stew was salted right and whether the porch boards needed a second coat before the rains came. 3 years of being invisible. She was good at it. She had learned early that invisibility was its own kind of armor. A housekeeper who did her work quietly, who answered questions with a nod and a yes sir and a no sir, who never raised her eyes too long or laughed too loud or offered an opinion. Nobody asked for that woman was furniture. That woman was safe. That woman could stay. And staying was everything. She had not come to the Sullivan Ranch in the autumn of 1883 looking for comfort. She had come because there was no other way in. The land records were locked inside the territorial office in Mill Haven, and the territorial office in Mill Haven answered to men like Gerald Weston, who answered to men like the late Robert Sullivan, Henry's father, who had built his empire the way most empires in the West got built. Quietly. Legally on paper. Ruthlessly everywhere else. Margaret's father had not understood that ruthlessness until it was already finished. By the time Elias Holt realized what the contract he'd signed actually said, what the fine print clause buried in the 4th paragraph of a 10-page land transfer agreement actually meant, his ranch was already gone. Not taken by force. Not stolen in the dark. Taken in broad daylight in a lawyer's office with 2 witnesses and a notary seal and her father's own shaking signature at the bottom of the page. He had signed because Robert Sullivan told him it was a loan agreement, a temporary arrangement. 40 acres of the western parcel as collateral, just until the drought broke and the cattle prices recovered. The drought broke. The prices recovered. The land did not come back. Elias Holt spent 4 years fighting it through the courts, spending money he didn't have on lawyers who took his fees and filed his motions, and lost every single hearing to men who had been having dinner with the judge since before Margaret was born. He died in the spring of 1881 in a rented room above a feed store in Mill Haven, with a cough that had started as a cold and never stopped, and a letter in his coat pocket that he had written to his daughter and never sent. She found it after the funeral, when she was going through the things the landlord hadn't already taken. She read it standing in the middle of that bare room, with the smell of boiled cabbage coming up through the floorboards and the sound of wagons rattling past in the street below, and she did not cry. She had already done her crying. What she felt reading her father's careful, cramped handwriting. The way he apologized to her. The way he said he was sorry. He hadn't been smarter. Sorry. He hadn't been harder. Sorry. He'd trusted a man who wore a Sunday face on a Monday soul. What she felt was something colder and more useful than grief. She felt clarity. The letter named everything. It named the clause. It named the date. It named the original parcel boundaries from before the agreement was signed. And it named the one piece of evidence her father had never been able to produce in court, a copy of the original survey map from 1874. The one that proved the western parcel had been fully paid off before the loan agreement was ever drawn up. Her father believed that copy existed. He believed Robert Sullivan had kept it. He believed it was somewhere on the Sullivan Ranch. That was why Margaret came, not for revenge. She had turned that word over in her mind during the 2 years between her father's death and the morning she walked up to the Sullivan Ranch house and asked the foreman if they were hiring household help. Revenge was for people who wanted the other person to suffer. She didn't want Henry Sullivan to suffer. She didn't know Henry Sullivan. She wanted the land. She wanted what her father had been owed. She wanted the 40 acres back, and she wanted the legal record corrected, and she wanted to be able to plant something in that ground and watch it grow without owing anyone anything for it. That was the whole of it. That was the plan. The plan after 3 years had not worked. She had searched carefully, methodically. She had used the particular invisibility of her position, the way a housekeeper moves through rooms that other people consider private, the way nobody locks a desk drawer against the woman who dusts it, and she had searched every drawer, every cabinet, every box of old papers she could find and access without drawing attention. She had found Robert Sullivan's business records. She had found his correspondence. She had found in a locked tin box behind the false back of the study bookshelf a set of documents that would have made a lesser woman quit entirely. Records that showed not just what had been done to her father, but what had been done to 3 other families in the same decade, the same clause, the same trick over and over. But she had not found the survey map, which meant it was either gone burned or buried with Robert Sullivan 2 years before she arrived, or it was hidden somewhere she hadn't reached yet. That morning, the morning everything changed, she had been looking in the one place she had always avoided: Henry's room. She had avoided it for reasons she didn't want to examine too carefully. His room was different from the rest of the house. The rest of the Sullivan Ranch house was Robert Sullivan's house, big, careful, built to impress every piece of furniture chosen to make a statement about the kind of man who lived there. Henry's room was something else. It was plain: a single bed, a wooden chair, a dresser with a cracked corner she had offered to fix twice, and he had twice refused to let her bother with, a rifle on the wall, a pair of work gloves on the windowsill that he never seemed to remember to take outside. The room was honest in a way the rest of the house wasn't, and honesty made her uncomfortable when she was there for dishonest reasons. But she had run out of places. She had gone in that morning while he was out on the North Range with his foreman, a man named Dutch, who had worked the Sullivan land since before Henry was born, and who watched Margaret with a kind of steady, unreadable attention that she had never quite been able to dismiss. She had gone in with her cleaning bucket as Cover closed the door behind her and started methodically with the dresser. Nothing. The chair. The space beneath the bed. The loose board she'd noticed months ago near the east wall that she'd marked in her memory as a possibility. She pressed it with her heel. It shifted. Her hands were not shaking. She told herself that very clearly. Her hands were not shaking because this was not the first loose board she had checked in 3 years, and it was probably nothing, and she was a practical woman who did not let herself feel hope until she had something concrete to feel hope about. She knelt down, worked the board up with the small flat tool she carried in her apron pocket. She had started carrying it in the second month when she'd realized what kind of search she was actually conducting. The board came up clean. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of papers. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then she picked up, unwrapped the top corner, and saw the edge of a document. Old paper, brown at the margins, with the kind of careful draftsmanship that meant a professional survey. She pulled it free. It was dated April 1874. It was a survey of the western parcel of what had then been the Holt property. And in the bottom right corner, in faded red ink, was the notation, "Paid in full encumbrance, released, R.A. Sullivan, witnessed." Her father's name was in the body of the document. His land. His proof. Hidden under the floorboards of the man she had been cooking breakfast for every morning for 3 years. She was still kneeling there holding it when the door opened. She heard him before she saw him. The particular rhythm of Henry Sullivan's boot steps, the way his left heel came down a fraction harder than his right, an old injury from a horsefall that she had noticed in the first week and catalogued the way she catalogued everything about this house and the people in it. She heard that rhythm in the hallway, and she had exactly 1 second to make a decision. She did not make it fast enough. He pushed the door open and stopped. She was on her knees in the middle of his floor, with the floorboard propped up beside her, and the survey map in her hands, and no cleaning bucket anywhere near her, because she had left it by the dresser and was currently crouched 4 feet away from it in a position that had no innocent explanation. Henry Sullivan looked at her. Then he looked at the floorboard. Then he looked at the papers in her hands. I was not a man who shouted. She had learned that about him in the first month. He had a temper. She had seen it twice, once with a cattle buyer who tried to cheat Dutch on a weight count, once with a neighboring rancher who had let his fence line drift into Sullivan water rights. But it was not a hot temper. It was cold and quiet and deliberate, and it was in its way more frightening than shouting. Margaret. Just her name. Flat. Waiting. She stood up. She did not put the paper down. That was a decision she made in the instant of standing. If she was discovered, she was going to be discovered, clearly not caught trying to hide what she already had. She straightened her back and looked at him directly. I can explain. I'd appreciate that. 3 years of careful invisibility, and it came down to this. Him standing in the doorway. Her standing in the middle of his floor. The survey map in her hand like evidence at a trial, which was, she supposed, exactly what it was. She told him. Not everything, not in that first minute, but enough. She told him about her father, about the contract, about the western parcel and the clause and the 4 years of court cases that had eaten Elias Holt alive from the inside out, while Robert Sullivan went on running his ranch and buying more land and sitting in the front pew at church on Sundays. She told him she had come looking for this document because her father had believed it existed, and because it was the only thing that could correct what had been done. She told him she was sorry for coming into his room without permission. She did not tell him she was sorry for searching. She wasn't, and she was not going to lie about that. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Henry had not moved from the doorway. He had not interrupted her once, which was either a good sign or a very bad one, and she genuinely could not tell which. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. Not anger, not surprise exactly. Something more complicated than either. How long have you been looking? His voice was even. Careful. 3 years. Something moved across his face at that. Fast, and then gone. You've been in this house for 3 years looking for that paper. Yes. And you stayed, even when you didn't find it. I wasn't sure it was here. I couldn't stop until I was. He looked at the document in her hand. May I see it? It was the last request she had expected. She had expected anger. She had expected him to demand she leave. She had been mentally calculating she had enough money saved for a month of rent in Mill Haven. She knew the name of a lawyer who was not in anyone's pocket. She had kept copies of her father's original documents in a lockbox at the general store under a false name. She had a plan for being discovered. She had not made a plan that included him asking politely to look at the evidence. She crossed the room and held it out to him. He took it, read it again. His jaw was tight, but his hands were steady. He did this to 3 other families. She said it because she needed him to know it wasn't singular, wasn't a misunderstanding. I found the records in the study. Your father ran the same scheme 4 times over 12 years. I know about the others. She went still. She stopped, started again. You know, I found those records 2 years ago. He folded the survey map with the kind of careful attention that told her he understood what he was holding. I've been trying to figure out what to do about it. The floor seemed to shift slightly beneath her. Not literally, she was too practical a woman for dramatic physical responses to shock, but something in her internal architecture rearranged itself without her permission. 3 years. He had known for 2 of them. While she was searching his house, he had already known. You didn't do anything. I didn't know what the right thing was. My father built this ranch. These people worked for him. The families He stopped, pressed his mouth together. I couldn't hand the law records to a court and watch it all unravel without knowing what it would do to the people who depended on this place. My father died. The words came out flat. Not accusing, just fact. The flattest, most absolute fact she owned. I know. He set the survey map on the dresser, carefully, like it was something that deserved to be handled with respect. And I'm sorry. That's not enough, and I know it's not enough, but I am. She did not know what to do with a Sullivan who apologized. That was the honest truth of it, and she was a woman who valued honesty even when it was inconvenient. She had spent 3 years building a very clear architecture of who and what she was dealing with. A powerful family, an unjust situation, a legal wrong that needed correcting, and the architecture had not included this. It had not included him standing in his plain, honest room, holding her father's stolen document and saying he was sorry. She took the survey map back from the dresser. "I need this, for the legal claim." "I know. I'll be leaving." "Where are you going?" "Millhaven. There's a lawyer. Thomas Eade." She stopped again. "He's the only one in the territory who doesn't answer to the Weston Bank," Henry said. "I know. I consulted him 6 months ago, about the other families." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've been working on this. Slowly, badly, without knowing half of what you apparently figured out in 3 years of cleaning my house." He said it without any particular edge, just a kind of rueful recognition that landed oddly. "The survey map was the piece I was missing. I found the other records. I couldn't find the original survey. It was under your floorboard. I know that now." "You didn't know before?" "No." He looked at the board still propped against the wall. "I didn't know it was there. My father must have hidden it specifically. He wasn't the kind of man who liked to destroy evidence outright. He liked having it where he could reach it if he ever needed it." Margaret thought about that. Thought about Robert Sullivan keeping the one piece of paper that proved his own wrongdoing hidden under his son's floor. The arrogance of it was almost impressive. The certainty that it would never be found because his son would never look, and the hired help would never dare. He had been almost right. "The 3 other families," she said. "What happened to them?" "2 left the territory. 1 is still on their land, but paying rent they shouldn't have to pay to a land company my father set up that's now technically mine." His mouth pulled to one side. "I've been managing it at a loss since I found out trying to figure out the cleanest way to undo it legally without creating more problems." "That's—" She stopped. "Go ahead." "That's a complicated position to be in." "It is. Most men in your position would have ignored it. I'm aware." He looked at her steadily. "I'm also aware that you came into my house under false pretenses and spent 3 years deceiving me, and that I should probably be a great deal angrier about that than I am." "You can be angry if you want." "I'm working up to it." A pause. "What's your father's first name?" The question came at her sideways, unexpected. "Elias." Henry nodded slowly, like he was placing the name somewhere important. "Tell me what you need to make this right, legally, all of it." She did not trust it. She wanted to be clear about that even in the privacy of her own thinking. She was not a naive woman. She had not survived the last 5 years by trusting men who had something to gain from her trust. Henry Sullivan had every reason to appear cooperative in this moment. She had the survey map. She had clearly been in this house long enough to know things about his family's business that could do real damage, and a man in his position would understand immediately that the smart play was to get ahead of whatever she was planning, rather than push her toward a lawyer with a full set of grievances. She understood all of that. She held it carefully in her mind as she followed him downstairs to the kitchen. Her kitchen, the one she had managed and organized and known every corner of for 3 years, and sat across the table from him while he put the coffee on himself without asking her to. That small thing caught at her more than it should have. He knew where the coffee was kept. He knew how to work the stove. He had just never shown any of that because she was always there to do it, and it had not occurred to her to wonder whether that was indifference or consideration. "The legal claim is straightforward once you have the survey map," she said, keeping herself on the practical ground. "The original contract had a fraudulent misrepresentation built into it. With the survey proving the parcel was unencumbered before the agreement, the contract is void." "My lawyer agrees." "When did you see Thomas Eade?" "March. That was 5 months ago. I was moving slowly, I told you. You told me you didn't know what the right thing was. Both things are true." He set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from her with the directness she had always associated with him. No performance, no preamble. It was one of the things about him that had made her job harder. She had counted on him being like his father. He hadn't cooperated with that expectation. "I want to move forward on this. I want the record corrected. All 4 of the families, including your father's estate, which means you, I assume. My father had no other children. Then yes, you. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. I want to do this right, which means I need you to help me. I don't work here anymore. I know. A pause. I'm not asking you to work here. I'm asking you to work with me on this. There's a difference. She looked at him across the table. 3 years of looking at this man from across a careful professional distance, from the other side of doorways, and meal services, and fire building, and the 1,000 small domestic transactions that make up a household, and she had assembled what she thought was a clear picture of him. Capable. Fair with his workers. Honest in his business as far as she had been able to observe. Lonely in a way that he didn't complain about, which she had always thought was either dignity or denial. She had not assembled a picture of a man who already knew what his father had done and had been struggling with it in silence for 2 years. Why didn't you go to the families directly? She asked. Because going directly to them means telling them something devastating about a man who's been dead for 4 years and can't defend himself, which means whatever I say reads as self-serving. He turned his cup slowly on the table. A wealthy rancher coming to poor families and saying his dead father wronged them. Here's some restitution. There's no version of that conversation that doesn't put them in a position of owing something, even if the money goes the right direction. She hadn't thought of it that way. That was an uncomfortable realization. She had been so focused on the wrong that had been done, and the mechanism for correcting it, that she hadn't thought through the particular texture of the correction, the way power imbalances didn't disappear just because the money changed direction. He had thought about it. He had thought about it for 2 years and gotten himself tangled up in the thinking, which had resulted in inaction, which was its own kind of failure. But the thinking itself was more careful than she had given him credit for. You need someone who isn't a Sullivan to bring this forward, she said slowly. Yes. A witness, an advocate, someone with standing who isn't implicated in the original wrong. Someone like a woman who came to this ranch looking for her father's stolen land and found it. He met her eyes. Someone whose claim is the anchor for all the others. The kitchen was very quiet around them. Outside, she could hear the usual ranch sounds, horses in the paddock, the distant knock of Dutch's hammer, somewhere on the south fence, the wind moving through the grass in the way it always did in September when the season started to shift. She had planned to leave this morning. She had planned to take the survey map and go directly to Millhaven and begin the legal process alone, which was how she had always imagined it, this clean, solitary act of reclamation that owed nothing to anyone. There's a man in Millhaven, she said. Gerald Weston. He was part of this. I know. He still has influence in the Territorial Land Office. I know that too. If we file the claim, he'll fight it. He'll try. He has money and connections and a 4-year head start on any legal challenge we raise. He does. And you're telling me you want to take this on? Henry looked at her steadily. My father built this ranch on a lie. I've been trying to figure out for 2 years how to live with that and whether I could fix it. You just walked out of my room with the piece I was missing. He paused. So yes, I'm telling you I want to take this on. The question is whether you're willing to do it together. She set her coffee cup down. She looked at her hands, which were the hands of a woman who had spent 3 years doing other people's cleaning and cooking, and had not minded because it was the cover she needed, but who had also somewhere in those 3 years learned every inch of this ranch and how it ran and what it needed and what it could produce if it were managed without the weight of a lie underneath it. She looked at the man across the table, who was not who she had assumed he was, and who was looking at her with an expression she still didn't have a name for, but which was becoming clearer the longer she looked. If we do this, she said carefully, and it works, the legal claim succeeds, the record is corrected. Yes. Then the 40 acres come back to me. They should have been yours already. I want that in writing before we take another step. He nodded without hesitating. That's fair. I'm not... She stopped, chose her words. I'm not a woman who needs rescuing, Mr. Sullivan. I came here with a plan. It took longer than I expected, but I found what I came for. I know. I'm telling you that because I want you to understand that any arrangement we make is between equals. I'm not accepting charity. I'm not accepting protection. If we move forward as two people with aligned interests, and I retain full decision-making authority over everything that concerns my father's land. Those are reasonable terms. They're not negotiable. I didn't say they were. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. For what it's worth, a woman who spent 3 years running a household as cover for a legal investigation and managed to find evidence my father hid from everyone, including me, is not a woman I'd be fool enough to try to rescue. She didn't know what to do with that either. She was developing a list of things about Henry Sullivan that she didn't know what to do with. It was an uncomfortable list. She was going to have to think about it at length later when she was alone and had the privacy to be confused without an audience. I'll stay through the end of the week, she said. Not as your housekeeper, as a partner in the legal matter. We meet with Thomas Eade together. You bring your records from the study. I bring the survey map and my father's original documents. We lay it all out for him and we follow his advice on sequence. Agreed. And you tell me everything you know about Gerald Weston. Everything. Not the surface version, the real version. Whatever your father told you, or whatever you've found out since. Henry's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something that looked a great deal like relief, and she filed that away carefully, because a man who felt relieved at the prospect of telling the truth was a man who had been carrying the weight of it for a very long time. I'll tell you everything, he said. She nodded once. Then she stood up and began clearing the coffee things, because they were there and needed clearing, and because she had learned over the past 3 years that her hands worked better than her head when her head was full of too many things at once. She had come to this ranch looking for a piece of paper. She had found it. She had also found something she hadn't been looking for, which was, she was honest enough to acknowledge it at least privately, a great deal more complicated. Outside, the September wind moved through the grass. Dutch's hammer knocked steadily in the distance. The Sullivan Ranch went about its business the way it always did, as if this morning had been an ordinary morning, as if the woman who had spent 3 years inside its walls, hiding her real name and her real purpose, had not just laid both of them down on the kitchen table. She washed the cups. She dried them. She put them back in the cabinet she had organized in her second week and had not changed since. Henry Sullivan sat at the table and did not leave and did not speak, and she understood somehow that he was giving her the silence she needed to settle into what had just happened, and she did not know what to do with that either, so she added it to the list and kept her hands busy and waited for the morning to tell her what came next. But the morning had other plans, because before the coffee cups were fully dry, Dutch Malone's boots hit the porch steps hard and fast, and a man who had not hurried for anything in 30 years was hurrying now. He didn't knock. Dutch never knocked. He pushed through the door and stopped when he saw them both. Margaret at the sink. Henry still at the table, and whatever he had come to say seemed to recalibrate behind his eyes in the space of a single breath. We've got a rider coming up the South Road. His voice was flat the way it got when he was choosing his words with care. Weston's man. The one he sends when he's not ready to come himself. Henry was on his feet before Dutch finished the sentence. Which one? Briggs. Something moved across Henry's face that Margaret hadn't seen there before. Not quite fear. Something harder than fear and more controlled. How far out? 10 minutes, maybe less. Henry turned and looked at her. Not asking her to leave, not telling her to hide. Just looking with the particular expression of a man who understood that the next 10 minutes were going to matter and was deciding how much he wanted her inside them. She made the decision for him. She set the dish towel down and turned to face Dutch fully. Is Briggs the kind of man who reports back exactly what he sees, or does he report back what Weston wants to hear? Dutch blinked. In 3 years, she had never asked him a direct operational question about ranch business. She watched him recalibrate again faster this time. Reports what he sees, that's why Weston uses him. Then Henry needs to be in the yard when he arrives, not in the house. In the yard working normal morning. She picked up the survey map from where Henry had set it on the counter and folded it into her apron pocket. Whatever Weston sent him to look for, he shouldn't find anything that looks like a disruption. Dutch looked at Henry. Henry looked at Margaret. The kitchen held that look for a long moment. "She's right," Henry said. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "The papers in the study, the records I mentioned. I'll put them back exactly where they were. You know where they were. I put them back every time I looked at them. 3 years of practice." Something crossed his face that she couldn't read in the half-second before he turned and went out the door with Dutch at his shoulder. She was already moving toward the study. She had 8 minutes by her estimate. She used all of them. By the time she heard the rider in the yard, every document in the study was in its proper place. The false back of the bookshelf was seated flush, and she was in the kitchen with flour on her apron and a bowl of biscuit dough in front of her that she had mixed from nothing in 4 minutes flat because her hands knew the recipe without consulting her brain. She listened through the window she had cracked open 2 inches just enough. Briggs had a voice like gravel on a tin roof. Loud without meaning to be the kind of man who had never learned that volume wasn't the same as authority. "Mr. Weston wanted me to remind you about the partnership meeting Thursday. He's expecting your answer on the water rights proposal before then. He'll have it." Henry's voice came back even and unhurried. She could picture him exactly standing with his thumbs in his belt weight on his right foot, the way he stood when he was managing a conversation rather than having one. "Anything else?" A pause that was 1 beat too long. "Mr. Weston mentioned he heard you'd had some changes around the property, staff and such." "Dutch hired a new hand on the north fence last month. That's about the extent of it." "Nothing else. Should there be—" Another pause. She pressed a little closer to the window, keeping her hands moving in the dough. "No, sir. I'll tell him Thursday then." She heard the horse turn. Heard it move back down the road at an easy pace, not hurried, which meant Briggs had seen nothing alarming, which meant he would report nothing alarming. She let out a breath she had not consciously been holding and pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. Henry came back inside 2 minutes later. He looked at the biscuit dough. He looked at her. "You made biscuits." "I needed something to do with my hands." He sat down at the table again. "Weston knows something is moving. He doesn't know what." "How long before he finds out we've contacted Ide?" "Depends on whether Ide's clerk talks. He usually doesn't, but Weston has money, and money loosens things." He set his hands flat on the table. "We need to move faster than I was planning." She turned to look at him directly. "How much faster?" "I was thinking we'd take a week to prepare. Get our documentation organized draft, the initial filing. Give Ede time to review the survey map before we sit down with him." He paused. "I think we need to be in Millhaven by Wednesday." Wednesday was 3 days away. She had planned to spend those 3 days going through everything, methodically making copies of every document, building a case file tight enough that Weston's lawyers would need a crowbar to find a gap in it. 3 days was not enough time for that. But she had been in this territory long enough to know that when Gerald Weston started sending men to look at things, the window for moving quietly closed fast. "Wednesday," she said. "Then we have a great deal of work to do." She pulled the biscuit dough into rounds and put them in the pan and slid the pan into the oven, because she had started the biscuits and there was no reason to waste them. Then she wiped her hands on a clean cloth and sat down across from him and said, "Tell me about Weston. Everything. Start from the beginning." "Yeah." Henry looked at her for a moment. That same unreadable look she was accumulating a collection of. And then he started talking, and she listened the way she had learned to listen in 3 years of being a housekeeper, which was completely without interruption, storing everything. What he told her in the next 2 hours dismantled most of what remained of her original architecture. She had known Gerald Weston was involved. She had known it from her father's records, from the way his name appeared in the corner of correspondence between Robert Sullivan and various territorial officials, always at one remove, never the signatory, always the witness, always the man who knew about the thing without being the man who did it. She had categorized him as a facilitator, a powerful one certainly, but a secondary actor. Henry told her he was not secondary. Weston had been the architect. Robert Sullivan had been the instrument. The land scheme had been Weston's design from the beginning. He had identified the families, assessed the value of their properties, calculated the legal mechanism, and brought it to Robert Sullivan, with a division of proceeds that Robert had found acceptable. Weston took cash from land sales. Sullivan took the land itself. The lawyer who had drawn up the contracts, a man named Aldrich, who had since died conveniently of a heart complaint, had been paid by both. My father thought he was the one using Weston, Henry said. He told me once I was about 15, he told me that you should always know which man in a partnership is the senior one. He said the senior man was the one who walked away with more. A pause. He thought he was that man. Was he? Weston now owns 3 times the land my father ever did. Through holding companies, through the territorial bank, through arrangements that wouldn't survive sunlight if someone put them in front of the right court. Henry's jaw was tight. My father thought he was building an empire. He was building Weston's empire. He just didn't live long enough to see it clearly. Margaret absorbed that, rearranged her internal picture of the situation accordingly. It shifted things substantially, not in terms of the legal claim itself, which remained straightforward, but in terms of what Weston would do when the claim was filed. A man who was merely connected to the scheme might negotiate, might find a way to distance himself, might decide the cost of fighting wasn't worth the exposure. A man who was the architect of the scheme had everything to lose. That kind of man didn't negotiate. That kind of man destroyed the threat before it became a problem. He'll come after the filing directly, she said. Yes. He'll challenge our standing, try to discredit the survey map, possibly try to discredit me personally. You came here under a false name. She had been waiting for that. She met his eyes steadily. My name is Margaret Holt. I've never used another name in this county. I told your foreman my name when I applied for the position. Whatever I withheld about my reasons for being here, I didn't lie about who I was. Henry nodded slowly. That's an important distinction. Weston's lawyers will try to make it not one. Then we need Ede to get ahead of it, frame it correctly before they can frame it wrong. He stood and went to the window. Stood there with his back to her, looking at whatever was outside. There's something else. She waited. Weston is going to find out you were here. 3 years living on this ranch, that's not a secret that holds once the filing is public. He's going to put together who you are and what you were doing, and he's going to use it. I know. He's going to tell people you deceived me, that you manipulated your way into my household to gather evidence. He's going to make it look like... He stopped. Like I'm a dishonest woman pursuing a dishonest claim. She kept her voice level. I've considered that. Henry turned from the window. And the answer to that is the survey map. The document speaks for itself. What I had to do to find it doesn't change what it says. She held his gaze. But you should know that it's going to be used against you too. A man whose housekeeper spent 3 years searching his house. Weston will make you look like either a fool or a co-conspirator, whichever damages you more. I'm aware of that. It may cost you, socially, in your business relationships. Some of these ranchers have known your family for 30 years. I know who they are, Henry. She used his first name for the first time and felt the strangeness of it. 3 years of Mr. Sullivan, and now his first name sitting plainly in the air between them. I want you to understand clearly what you're agreeing to. This is not a simple legal filing. This is a declaration of war against a man who has been quietly building power in this territory for 20 years. He will retaliate against the claim against me and against you. Your cooperation in this becomes part of the story, and some people in this county are going to see that story as a betrayal of your family. My family betrayed 4 other families first. The directness of it stopped her. She had expected him to defend himself a little, to qualify, to explain the complicated position of a son who had inherited something he hadn't chosen. She had expected some version of it wasn't my fault, which was true, and which she would have accepted, but which would have told her something specific about the kind of man she was dealing with. He didn't say any of that. He said my family betrayed 4 other families first. She let that settle. Then she said, all right, all right. All right, Wednesday, Thomas Ede, we bring everything. The biscuits had begun to smell ready. She got up and checked them golden solid the way she liked them, the way she had made them every morning for 3 years, and pulled them out and set them on the rack. She heard Henry cross the kitchen behind her and stop. "You know," he said, "in 3 years you never once made extra." She turned to look at him. There was a plate of 12 biscuits between them on the counter. She had made her regular amount without thinking about it, just as she did every morning. As if this morning were ordinary. As if she weren't standing in a kitchen she had occupied under false pretenses with a stolen survey map in her apron pocket and a man she had fundamentally misjudged looking at her with an expression she was running out of ways to not name. "Old habit," she said. I took one from the rack without asking, which was also something he had never done in 3 years, and she recognized it for what it was. A small, deliberate crossing of the professional line she had drawn between them. A first step over a boundary that had just become in the last 2 hours somewhat beside the point. She did not object. She took one herself and ate it, standing at the counter, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, and the morning moved around them with its normal sounds, and something that had been wound very tight inside her chest for 3 years, loosened just slightly, like a knot that hadn't given way, but had acknowledged for the first time that it could. That afternoon she went through the study again. Not searching this time, organizing. She had 3 years of cataloged knowledge of what was in every drawer and cabinet, and she moved through the room efficiently, pulling documents, sorting them, building the case file she had imagined. Henry sat at the desk and went through the locked tin box she had never been able to open. He had the key on his watch chain, and she noticed without comment that he had apparently always had it. The documents inside the tin box were worse than what she had found before. She read them as he passed them to her one by one. 4 families. 4 contracts. The arithmetic of what each family had lost, laid out in Robert Sullivan's careful, precise handwriting, as if it were ordinary accounting. The names of the territorial officials who had been paid to look the other way. The name of the judge who had dismissed the Holt case 3 times running. The amount he had been paid each time. Her father had been fighting a fixed game. Had not known it was fixed. Had gone into courtroom after courtroom, believing that the truth had weight in a system that had already been bought. She held the last page very still and did not look up for a moment. "Margaret." She looked up. Henry was watching her with the particular attentiveness of a man who understood that something significant was happening to the person across from him and was not going to pretend otherwise. "He never had a chance," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Every time he walked into that courtroom, he never had a chance. No. He thought he did. He spent everything he had 4 years, all his money, his health, believing that if he just found the right evidence, filed the right motion. She set the page down carefully. He died believing he had failed. He didn't fail. He didn't get the land back. He kept fighting until he physically couldn't. And his daughter continued the fight so effectively that she found in 3 years what his lawyers couldn't find in 4. Henry paused. "That's not failure. That's a different timeline." She looked at him across the desk. She had a great deal of experience by now at not letting things show on her face. It was a skill she had cultivated with great care over the past 5 years. And it had served her well, and she deployed it now, because what she was feeling in response to what he had just said was something she had not expected to feel and was not prepared to examine in present company. "We should get back to the documents," she said. Yes, they worked until the light went. Dutch brought food at some point and set it on the corner of the desk without a word, which told her that Dutch had read the situation and made his own calculations and landed somewhere that did not require commentary. She had always respected Dutch. This did not diminish that. By the time the oil lamp was necessary, they had a case file that Margaret estimated was as solid as 3 years of searching and 2 hours of tin box revelations could make it. Survey map. Original contract with the fraudulent clause annotated. Correspondence proving Weston's involvement. Financial records showing the payments to the judge. Documented evidence of 3 additional families subjected to the same scheme. It was, she thought, almost enough. Almost, because almost was all you ever got before you walked into a courtroom, and the rest was argument and luck and the particular quality of mercy or its absence in whoever was listening. "Ede will want to know about the judge," she said. "Whether he's still on the bench. He retired 2 years ago. The new judge in Millhaven is a man named Carver. Younger. He came from the Eastern District, no history with Weston that I know of. That's either very good or very carefully arranged. Henry looked at her. You think like a suspicious person. I think like someone who watched a fixed system eat her father alive. She met his eyes. It's a useful way to think. I know. He closed the case file and set his hands on top of it. For what it's worth, my read on Carver is that he's clean. I've watched him in 3 land disputes since he took the bench. He rules on the law, not on who he had dinner with. We'll see. Tuesday passed in preparation. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cool. The kind of September morning that tasted like autumn was making a serious attempt. Margaret had her bag packed before sunrise. The case file, her father's original documents from the Millhaven lockbox she would retrieve on the way, a change of clothes, and the survey map in the inner pocket of her coat, where she could put her hand on it without thinking. She met Henry in the yard. He had the wagon ready. Dutch was there too, standing slightly to one side with his hands in his pockets, and an expression that she had come to recognize as Dutch at his most communicative. You two going to Millhaven? Dutch said. It was not a question. Business, Henry said. Dutch looked at Margaret. You find what you came looking for? She held his gaze. Yes. Dutch nodded slowly. Then he said, Your father was a good man, Miss Holt. I knew him some. Not well, but some. He used to sell horses at the summer market in Denton. Good horses, honest prices. He paused. He deserved better than he got. She had been managing her emotions with considerable discipline for the past 2 days. Dutch's straightforward, quiet statement very nearly undid that management completely. Thank you, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. Dutch stepped back. Henry helped her up to the wagon seat, not intrusively, just a hand offered and taken, and they turned out of the yard onto the road south. They did not speak much for the first hour. The road to Millhaven was one she had traveled several times, always alone, always with the particular hyper-awareness of a woman carrying a secret. Traveling it now with everything she'd kept hidden, finally in the open, felt like a different kind of journey entirely. Lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Dutch knew, she said finally. Henry kept his eyes on the road. He figured it out sometime in the 2nd year. He told me he had a feeling about you, but he couldn't put words to it. Said you were too precise, too careful. Said women who just needed work didn't move through a house like they were memorizing it. She absorbed this. He didn't say anything to you. He told me his feeling, and then he said he thought you had your reasons, and that whatever they were, you weren't a danger to the ranch. A pause. Dutch has good instincts about people. He was being charitable. He was being accurate. You weren't a danger to the ranch. I was a danger to your family's legal standing. That's different. Something in his voice shifted. The ranch didn't do anything wrong. The people who live and work on it didn't do anything wrong. Dutch has been here since he was 19 years old, and he's given this place 30 years of honest work. Whatever my father did, it's not Dutch's debt to pay. She thought about that as the wagon rolled south. She thought about the way he had separated the ranch from his father's actions. Not defensively, not to excuse anything, but as a genuine moral distinction. The land itself was not guilty. The people working it were not guilty. What had been done to acquire some of it was guilty, and that wrong needed correcting, but correcting it didn't require burning everything down. She had come to this ranch thinking in terms of recovery, her land returned. She had not spent much time thinking about the after. What came after the legal filing? What the territory looked like when the truth was in the open and the record was corrected, and Weston had been forced to account for what he'd arranged. She was thinking about it now. 2 hours out of Millhaven on a stretch of road that ran along a dry creek bed with open country on both sides. Henry pulled the wagon to a stop. She looked at him. He was looking at something on the road ahead, a rider sitting still on a horse, about 300 yards out. Not moving. Just waiting. That's not a coincidence, she said. No. Weston moved fast. He always does. Henry's voice was completely even. He kept his eyes on the rider. That's Briggs again. Margaret felt something cold and clear move through her. Not fear. Something more useful than fear, the particular sharpening of attention that came when something she had been anticipating arrived ahead of schedule. She had known Weston would react. She had not calculated that he would react before they reached Eade's office, which meant he knew more than they had realized. "He has someone at Eade's office," she said. "Has to. He knew we made an appointment." "Yes." She reached into her coat and felt the survey map under her fingers. Still there. "What does he want from this conversation?" "To know how serious we are. To assess what we have." Henry glanced at her sideways. "To try to make us stop before we start." "What are you going to tell him?" Henry picked up the reins. "Let's find out." He clicked to the horses, and they rolled forward. The gap between the wagon and the rider closed steadily, 200 yards, 150-100. Briggs sat his horse without moving, and up close, he was a bigger man than he'd seemed at a distance, with the particular stillness of someone who had been sent to deliver a message and intended to deliver it regardless of reception. He touched his hat brim. "Mr. Sullivan?" "Briggs. Mr. Weston asked me to catch you before you got to town." His eyes moved to Margaret, assessed her, moved back to Henry. He thought it might be worth having a conversation before things got complicated. "Things are already complicated," Henry said. "They've been complicated for about 20 years. I'm just now getting around to saying so out loud." Briggs absorbed this without any visible reaction. "Mr. Weston figured you might feel that way. He wanted me to remind you that he and your father were partners for a long time. That there are arrangements between their estates that might get difficult to unwind if this goes the direction it sounds like it's going. Those arrangements are exactly what we intend to unwind. Mr. Sullivan, tell Weston I'll see him in court." Henry's voice had not changed volume or temperature. It was the same even deliberate voice he always used. But something underneath it had gone completely immovable. "And tell him that if he has anyone watching Thomas Eade's office, he should pull them back before I mention it to Judge Carver." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Margaret again, this time with real focus. "Miss Holt." She had not expected him to know her name. The coldness in her chest sharpened. She kept her face still. "Mr. Briggs, Mr. Weston wants you to know he was sorry to hear about your father." A pause designed to land like a threat wearing a courtesy's face. "He says Elias was a good man who made some unfortunate decisions." She looked at Briggs steadily and said very clearly, "My father made one unfortunate decision. He trusted Robert Sullivan's word instead of reading the contract paragraph by paragraph. He won't get to correct that, but I will." Briggs held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned his horse off the road and rode back the way he'd come, without another word. Henry watched him go. Then he looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes." She was. The coldness had organized itself into something cleaner, something she recognized. "He knew my name. He knew it before I said it. Weston's been watching this ranch." "For how long?" "Long enough." Henry turned the horses back onto the road. "Which means we were right to move Wednesday. If we'd waited, he'd have found something to use. A reason to file an injunction before we could. Something to complicate our standing." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "He's going to move fast now. He knows we're going to Eade. Then we move faster." They reached Millhaven by midday. Thomas Eade's office was on the second floor of a building on the main street. A deliberate choice, she had always thought, since you had to climb stairs to reach it, which meant anyone coming to see him had committed to the visit before they were halfway there. She went to the lockbox at the general store first, retrieved her father's documents, added them to the case file, went upstairs to Eade's office with Henry at her side and the case file under her arm, and everything she had spent 3 years building finally assembled in one place. Eade was a small man with very sharp eyes and the particular quality of attention that the best lawyers shared. He was already listening before you started talking, already sorting what you were going to say into categories he'd use later. He shook her hand first, which she noted. "Miss Holt, Mr. Sullivan." He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "I was expecting one of you on Thursday. I didn't expect both of you on Wednesday. We had a conversation on the road," Henry said. "We thought it best to accelerate." "Briggs, He found us 2 hours out. Edie's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Then we have less time than I hoped. He looked at the case file in her hands. Is that what I think it is? Margaret set it on his desk and opened it. Survey map original contract with fraudulent clause correspondence, establishing Weston as architect of the scheme financial records, showing payments to the presiding judge and documentation of 3 additional families. She laid each piece out as she named it. 4 families total, 20 years of a manufactured land scheme that Weston designed and Robert Sullivan executed. Ede picked up the survey map and read it. He read it the way lawyers read important documents, slowly, completely, with no expression whatsoever. Then he set it down and picked up the correspondence. He read for 11 minutes. She counted. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at them both. This is sufficient. Henry let out a breath that was the first indication in 2 days that he had been carrying any tension at all. It will be contested, Ede continued. Weston's lawyers are better than adequate, and they will challenge the provenance of every document, the validity of the survey, and most certainly the circumstances under which the survey was located. He looked at Margaret directly. Your presence in the Sullivan household is going to be the central attack. I know. They'll argue that you manipulated your way into a position of trust in order to gather evidence improperly. The survey map is my father's legal property that was obtained through fraud. The circumstances of its recovery are secondary to the document's validity. That is the correct legal argument. It is not always the winning argument when a jury is listening. He picked up his pen. Tell me everything about how you came to be employed at the Sullivan Ranch. Every detail. We're going to build the narrative before Weston's lawyers build theirs, she told him. All of it. The way she had learned to do with Henry completely without editing, including the parts that reflected poorly on her choices, if not her character. Ede listened without interrupting, and wrote things down in a small, cramped hand that covered a great deal of paper very quickly. When she finished, Ede set his pen down. Mr. Sullivan, you stated you were unaware of the survey map's location. I was, and your response upon discovering Miss Holt's purpose was to cooperate with the legal effort to correct the record. Yes. You understand that your cooperation is essential to the framing of this case. You are not a victim of Miss Holt's deception, you are a cooperating party in a rightful claim. That distinction matters enormously. I understand. Ede looked at them both for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not unprofessional, not warm exactly, but close. In 22 years of practice in this territory, I have seen a great deal of what men do with land and power. I have not often seen someone walk into my office with this much documentation, this much clarity, and this much at stake. He picked up the survey map again. We file Monday. I want the weekend to review everything and draft the filing language. I'll have 2 associate attorneys working through the night if I need to. He stood, shook Henry's hand, shook Margaret's hand. Miss Holt, he said, your father would be proud. She had managed Dutch without breaking. She managed Ede for approximately 4 seconds after he said that, and then she had to look at the window at the street below, at the ordinary commerce of a Wednesday in Millhaven. People and horses and wagons, and the business of daily life going forward, without any awareness that upstairs in this room, 3 people had just committed to pulling a thread that was going to unravel something that had been woven into this territory for 20 years. Henry did not say anything. He simply stood slightly closer than he had been standing before a small, solid adjustment of proximity that required no words and asked nothing of her, and she was grateful for that, in a way she was not yet ready to examine. She took one more breath, turned back to the room. Monday, she said. Monday, Ede agreed. She picked up the case file. Henry held the door. They went back down the stairs and out into the Wednesday afternoon, and Millhaven went on around them. And somewhere across town, Gerald Weston was about to find out that the thread had already been pulled. Somewhere across town. Gerald Weston was about to find out that the thread had already been pulled, and he found out faster than any of them had planned for, because when Henry and Margaret came down from Edie's office and turned onto the main street, Gerald Weston was already there. Not Briggs, not a messenger. Weston himself, I was standing in front of the Millhaven Territorial Bank, which he effectively owned, with two men at his shoulders, and the particular posture of a man who had arranged this encounter and wanted that fact clearly understood. He was older than Margaret had imagined from her father's descriptions, mid-60s, heavy through the chest, with white hair, and a face that had organized itself over decades into an expression of permanent patient authority. He looked like a man who had never once been surprised by anything, because he had always arranged things so that surprises didn't reach him. He looked at Henry first, then at Margaret, then at the case file under her arm. He smiled. It was a genuinely terrible smile, not cruel exactly, but the smile of a man who had seen a great many things in his life and had concluded that most of them would ultimately resolve in his favor. "Henry." His voice was smooth and unhurried. "I thought that might be Tom Eads' office you were coming out of." Henry stopped walking. Margaret stopped beside him. She could feel the weight of the street around them. Two men at the hardware store had paused their loading. A woman outside the milliner's had gone still. The particular arrested quality of a public moment that everyone present recognized as significant, even without knowing the specifics. "Gerald." Henry's voice was the same controlled temperature it always was. "I was going to let Eads send you the formal notice, but since you're here." "Since I'm here." Weston's gaze moved to Margaret again, lingered. "You must be Elias Holt's daughter. I wondered if you'd come looking eventually." The words were designed to land a specific way, casual, knowing, as if he had expected her and was not threatened by her presence. She understood the performance immediately. He was establishing for the benefit of whoever was watching that he had nothing to fear, that this was a nuisance, not a danger. She looked at him directly. "You knew my father." "I knew of him. Good man. Unfortunate situation." He spread his hands, slightly a gesture of regret that had been rehearsed until it looked natural. "These things happen in business. Land agreements are complicated. People don't always read the fine print as carefully as they should." "The fine print was fraudulent," she said. Clearly. Not loudly, she didn't need volume, she needed clarity, and the street was quiet enough that clarity carried. "The western parcel of my father's property was fully unencumbered when the agreement was signed. There is a survey map dated 1874, signed by Robert Sullivan himself, proving it. The contract clause that transferred that land was based on a misrepresentation. That's not a complicated business situation. That's fraud." Something moved in Weston's eyes. Very fast, and then gone. "That's a serious accusation, young woman." "It's a legal filing. You'll receive your copy from Thomas Ead on Monday." The two men at his shoulders exchanged a glance. Weston did not. He kept his eyes on Margaret with an expression that had lost by a small but measurable degree its quality of amused patience. "A survey map." He let the words sit. Interesting that one would surface after 20 years. "It was kept where Robert Sullivan put it," Henry said. "On my property. Your property." Weston turned his attention back to Henry, and now the smooth patience had a different quality, something underneath it that was harder and colder and more accurate. "Henry, I want to have a private conversation with you before this goes further. There are things about your father's estate, about your current legal position, with respect to certain arrangements that you need to understand before you commit to a course of action that can't be undone. There's nothing about my father's estate that justifies what he did to these families. That's a very noble position. It's also a position that may cost you considerably more than you've calculated." Weston's voice had dropped, not threatening exactly, but weighted the way a man's voice gets when he is delivering something he once received as a warning rather than a threat. "Your father made arrangements that protected this ranch. Some of those arrangements are tied to agreements with my bank. If you unwind one, you may find that others become complicated." Margaret felt something cold and precise click into place in her understanding. She looked at Henry. His jaw had tightened by a fraction. "He's got paper on the ranch," she said quietly. "Not a question. I have a lien," Weston said smoothly. "A perfectly legal and properly recorded lien against the Sullivan property dating from an agreement your father signed in 1879. A protective arrangement, we always called it. Your father understood it as insurance mutual interest keeping things stable. A pause. I would hate for that arrangement to become adversarial. There it was. She had known in the abstract that Weston would have a lever. Men like Weston always had a lever. They built their positions on multiple points of pressure, so that if one failed, another held. She had focused on the land scheme on the survey map on the 4 families. She had not focused on what he might hold against Henry directly. A lion on the Sullivan Ranch. If Weston called it, if he found grounds to accelerate the debt to demand payment. Henry couldn't make quickly enough, he could threaten the ranch itself. The home and livelihood of Dutch and every other person who worked that land. Henry was quiet for a moment. 3 seconds. 4. The street held its breath. I'll have Ede review the lien agreement Monday morning, Henry said. Before the filing. If it's legitimate, we'll address it. If it isn't, we'll address that too. Weston looked at him for a long moment. You're certain this is the road you want to take? I've been certain since I found my father's records 2 years ago. I'm more certain now. Henry held the older man's gaze with the particular quality of immovability that Margaret had seen in him twice before, and was beginning to understand was not stubbornness, so much as bedrock. I'm giving you the same notice you gave my father's house guests. Formal. Legal. Advance. A beat. The difference is ours is honest. Weston's smile came back. But it was different now, smaller, and behind it was something that was neither warmth nor amusement, but calculation, pure and cold. He nodded once precisely, and turned and walked back into the bank with his 2 men behind him, and the street exhaled. Henry turned to her immediately. The lien. I know. She was already thinking through it. Do you have the original agreement your father signed? In the study, in the tin box. Did you read it when you went through the box? I read everything. I didn't fully understand the lien clause at the time. I thought it was standard collateral language. Standard collateral language doesn't get used as leverage in a public street. She started walking back toward where they'd tied the wagon. We need to be back in Ede's office in the next 20 minutes. They turned around and went back up the stairs. They had just come down, and Ede looked at them when they walked back through his door, with the expression of a man who had been half expecting this. Weston was on the street, Henry said. I assumed. Ede put his pen down. What did he say? He has a lien on my property from 1879. He implied he'd call it if we proceed. Ede was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he stood up and went to his filing cabinet. I pulled the property records on the Sullivan Ranch last month when you first consulted me. I had a feeling this would come up. He pulled a folder, opened it, found the page he wanted, read it. The lien is recorded. The amount is substantial, $40,000. The original agreement was a promissory note tied to a credit facility with the Millhaven Territorial Bank. He looked at Henry. Do you have the original note? I'll have it here by tomorrow morning. I'll need it tonight if possible. The acceleration clause is the key. What conditions allow him to demand immediate payment? Standard lion language requires a default event. If you're current on any interest payments. I've never paid interest on it because I didn't know it carried interest. My father handled the finances until his death. I inherited the books and assumed the accounts were settled. Ede looked at him steadily. If no interest has been paid and the agreement calls for it, Weston could argue, you're already in default. The room was very quiet. Margaret turned this over carefully. Weston had not called the lien yet. He had mentioned it. He had established that it existed and that he was willing to use it. That was a different thing from using it. It was the display of a weapon, not the firing of one. Men who fired weapons immediately did not spend time displaying them. He wants us to withdraw, she said. He doesn't want to call the lien. Calling it costs him too. It puts his business practices in front of a court. And if we proceed anyway, which we will, he's exposed the lien as retaliation rather than a legitimate debt collection. That damages him with the judge. Ade looked at her. That's correct legal analysis. But if we can't show the lien is improper, we can't use it against him. We can only argue it's retaliatory. Also correct. So we need the original note tonight. Henry was already on his feet. I can ride back and be here by midnight. I'll go with you, Margaret said. There's no reason for you to make that ride. There's every reason. She picked up her coat. You'll be faster if Dutch helps you search, and I know exactly where everything is in that study. I organized it. She looked at Ida. We'll be back by midnight. Have your associates ready. Ida almost smiled. I'll have coffee made. They made the ride back to the ranch in less time than the morning's journey, because Henry pushed the horses harder, and the horses were willing. Dutch had food waiting. He always seemed to have food waiting. She had never entirely worked out how, and while Henry explained the situation in 8 precise sentences. Margaret was already in the study. She had the tin box open and the 1879 promissory note in her hand in 4 minutes. She read it in 6 more. She came back to the kitchen doorway, and Henry and Dutch both looked at her. There's no interest clause, she said. It's a flat loan, principal only due on a specific date. She looked at the document again. Due date is January 1885. Dutch made a sound in the back of his throat. January 1885 was 8 months ago, Henry said. Yes. She kept her voice level. The principal came due 8 months ago and was not paid, which means he is technically in default on the note, regardless of whether interest was current, because the entire sum was due, and he didn't know it. The kitchen held that for a moment. Can he call it? Henry asked. He can try, but look at this clause. She crossed the room and put the document in front of him, pointing. The acceleration provision requires 30 days written notice to the property holder before any enforcement action. He has not given that notice, which means even if he tries to call it tonight, you have 30 days minimum. 30 days to raise $40,000. 30 days to challenge the validity of the note itself. She looked at him directly. Henry, read the witness line. He looked, his jaw tightened. Aldrich, the same lawyer who drew up the fraudulent land contracts. The same man who died conveniently of a heart complaint. She set the document on the table. A promissory note witnessed by a man who has since been implicated in a pattern of fraudulent legal instruments, drawn up at the same period as those instruments structured to come due at a date the debtor was unlikely to track because it was 5 years in the future. She paused. Ede needs to see this tonight, Dutch said very quietly. Lord have mercy. They were back in Millhaven before 11. Ede read the note with his 2 associates leaning over his shoulders, and the particular concentrated silence of 3 lawyers, looking at something that was either going to make their case or complicate it catastrophically. The Aldrich connection is significant, Ede said finally. It's not dispositive. The note itself may be legitimate regardless of who witnessed it, but it establishes a pattern that makes a challenge viable. He looked up. Here's what this gives us. Weston cannot call this lien without giving 30 days notice. That gives us time to file the primary claim on Monday and let it get in front of Carver before Weston can use the lien as leverage. If the primary claim moves fast enough, will it? Henry asked. Land fraud cases with this level of documentation typically see expedited scheduling. Carver is efficient. If I request an emergency hearing on the grounds of imminent threat to property, which the lien threat constitutes, we may be in front of him within 2 weeks. He set the note down. Once we're in front of Carver, Weston calling the lien becomes retaliation in plain sight. That damages him with the court. So we file Monday, Margaret said. We request the emergency hearing, and we survive the next 30 days. That's the sequence, yes. What's the risk? Ede looked at her with the kind of honest directness she had come to associate with him. The risk is that Weston doesn't wait for the 30 days. The risk is that he has other levers we haven't found yet. The risk is that he finds a way to discredit the survey map before Carver sees it. A pause. And the risk is that people in this territory who have done business with Weston for 20 years decide that their relationship with him is more valuable than justice for 4 farming families and make that known to the court in ways that are difficult to counter. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside Millhaven was mostly asleep. The courthouse was dark across the street. Somewhere in this town, Gerald Weston was in a room with his own lawyers doing his own calculating, and she had no way of knowing what they were calculating. File on Monday, she said. Let's not give him the weekend to move. Ede looked at her, then at Henry. Henry nodded once. Saturday morning then, Ede said. First thing. They found rooms at the Millhaven Hotel separate, which was not a thing that required discussion, and which she noted. Henry handled without making it a thing that required discussion. A small courtesy, she filed away without comment. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and went through every document in the case file from memory, looking for gaps, looking for the angle. Weston's lawyers would exploit rehearsing arguments and counter-arguments until the rehearsal became a loop, and the loop became exhausting, and she finally slept somewhere around 3 in the morning. The dream, when it came, was not about courts or documents. It was her father's handwriting. The letter she had found in the rented room above the feed store. The way he had apologized to her. The way he had signed it. Not your father, the way most men would have signed a letter to their child, but Elias Holt. As if even in his most private correspondence, he needed to be clearly himself, clearly distinct, clearly a man with a name that meant something, even if the world had spent 4 years trying to persuade him otherwise. She woke before dawn with the particular clarity that sometimes came after a difficult sleep. She got dressed, went downstairs, found the hotel dining room empty, except for a cook who was willing to make coffee, and sat with it in the gray pre-dawn quiet, and let herself feel just for a few minutes the full weight of what she was carrying. 3 years. A borrowed name and a mop handle and a life built entirely in the service of a single purpose. The cooking and cleaning and careful invisibility. The daily performance of being a woman who wanted nothing more than the modest wage and the roof over her head. The conversations she had not had because having them would have required being real to someone, and being real meant being findable, and being findable meant being stopped before she was ready. She had been very lonely. She had not allowed herself to notice that while she was inside it. The noticing would have been a kind of weakness, and she had not had room for weakness. But sitting here now in the thin quiet before a Saturday that was going to change things irrevocably. One way or another, she allowed herself to notice it retroactively, to hold it plainly. 3 years of silence and strategy, and the particular grinding endurance of a person who has decided that what they want matters less for now than what they need to do. Her father had done the same thing. 4 years of grinding forward in courtrooms where the outcome was already purchased. He had known, she thought. She thought he must have known somewhere underneath the hope he kept presenting to the lawyers and the judges, and eventually to her, he must have known it wasn't working. And he had kept going anyway. Not because he was naive. Because stopping would have meant his daughter inherited nothing but the loss. She heard boots on the stairs. Knew the pattern of them before the dining room door opened. Henry came in, saw her, got his own coffee from the cook, without asking her if she'd slept or making any remark about the hour. He sat down across from her and wrapped his hands around his cup and was quiet. She appreciated that. After a while she said, "My father would have liked you." Henry looked at her. The comment had surprised him. She could see it, the small involuntary shift in his expression. "Why? You don't fill silence with noise." She turned her cup in her hands. He was like that. He thought a lot of men talked because they were afraid of what they'd hear if they stopped. He said the ones worth knowing were the ones who could be still. Henry was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was a careful man. I was. Not careful enough about the contract, but careful about people, about what they were. She looked at her coffee. He was the kind of man who should have had more time. The kind of man the world makes less of itself by losing too early. She had not said that to anyone before. She had not had anyone to say it to. Henry didn't respond immediately, which was correct, because it wasn't the kind of statement that wanted an immediate response. He let it sit in the room where it belonged between two people who were both awake before dawn for the same reason, and understood each other well enough by now to not perform around it. "When this is over," he said finally, "and the land is back in your name, what do you want to do with it?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The 40 acres, your father's land, when it's legally yours." He held her gaze steadily. "What do you want to plant on it?" She had thought about the land constantly for 5 years. She had thought about the claim, the evidence, the legal mechanism, the correction of the record. She had not, she realized in this moment, thought very much about the after. Standing on those 40 acres, with a clear title in her hand, and the question of what to grow. Something in her chest opened unexpectedly, like a door she had forgotten was there. "Wheat," she said. "My father always said the western parcel had the right soil for wheat. He never got the chance to prove it." Henry nodded slowly, like he was storing that information somewhere important, the same way he had stored her father's first name on the morning this all began. They sat in the early quiet for a while longer. When the light came up enough to read by, she opened the case file and they went through it together one more time, not because it needed reviewing, but because doing something concrete was better than sitting with the size of what was coming. Edie's office opened at 8. They were there at 5 past. The filing took 2 hours. Legal language was Edie's domain, and she understood enough of it to follow, but was wise enough to let him lead, asking questions when she needed to, and staying silent when silence was the right tool. Henry signed what he needed to sign. She signed what she needed to sign. The survey map was carefully copied. The copy certified the original returned to her at 10:45 on a Saturday morning in Millhaven. Thomas Ede walked across the street to this courthouse and filed a land fraud claim on behalf of Elias Holt's estate. Margaret Holt's surviving heir, and 3 additional plaintiff families against the estate of Robert Sullivan and Gerald Weston, personally supported by documentary evidence, including a survey map, fraudulent contract analysis, financial records of judicial corruption, and a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation extending over 12 years. Margaret stood on the courthouse steps and watched Ede hand the documents to the clerk. She had imagined this moment many times. She had imagined it as a culmination, a clean, definitive arrival at the thing she had been moving toward. She had imagined feeling something large and final. What she actually felt was afraid, not of losing. Afraid in the specific way of someone who has held a thing so long and so carefully that the moment of releasing it into something larger than herself felt like a kind of freefall. She had been the only person carrying this for 5 years. Now it was in a court filing in a clerk's hands, and it would go where it went, and she would not be able to control all of it. Henry appeared at her shoulder. Not touching, just there. "It's done," she said. "It started," he said, which was more accurate and also more honest than she was managing in the moment, and she was grateful for it. Ede came back across the street with his hands empty and his expression carefully neutral. Clerk logged it as received. Monday morning it goes to Carver's docket. I've included the emergency hearing request and the supporting documentation on the lien threat. He looked at them both. You should expect a response from Weston's attorneys within 24 hours of Monday. Probably less. I know, Henry said. And you should expect, Ede paused, chose his words. You should expect the response to come on multiple fronts. Legal, certainly. But Weston has operated in this territory for 20 years. He has relationships, obligations, owed influence in places that courts can't reach. Some of what he does in the next 2 weeks will not be legal maneuvering. It will be social and financial pressure against you personally, and against anyone associated with you. I was looking at Margaret when he said anyone associated with you. She understood him. She looked at Henry. This is the last moment to make a different decision, she said. Not offering it, not hoping for it, just being honest about the fact that it existed. Once Weston knows the filing is complete, and he'll know by this afternoon, the pressure starts. On you, on your ranch on Dutch, and everyone who works for you. This is the line. Henry looked at her with an expression that was completely clear. No conflict in it. No qualification. I know where the line is, Margaret. I've been standing on this side of it since Wednesday morning. Something in her chest did the thing. It had been doing with increasing frequency around this man. The thing she had been adding to her list of things she didn't know what to do with, and which the list was running out of room to contain. All right, she said. For what felt like the 100th time in 4 days, and it still meant something different each time. Ede said he would be in touch Monday evening at the latest. They shook hands. He went back inside. She turned to look at the courthouse. The door had closed behind the clerk. The filing was inside, logged real. A document with her father's name on it, and the names of 3 other families, and Gerald Weston's name in the defendant's line where it had never been before. Henry said, "We should eat something. You haven't eaten since last night." She almost laughed. It was such a practical thing to say in the middle of a consequential morning, and it was also true, and it was the kind of thing a person said to another person when they were paying close enough attention to notice. "All right," she said. "Let's eat." They found a lunch counter 2 streets over. They sat at the counter and ate without talking much, which was comfortable in the way that shared silences had become comfortable between them over the past 4 days. Not empty, not strained. Just 2 people who had run out of necessary words and didn't feel obligated to replace them with unnecessary ones. She was halfway through her coffee when she saw Briggs through the window. How was across the street? He had seen them. He was not trying to conceal the fact that he had seen them. He looked at the courthouse, then at the counter window. Then he turned and walked away at a steady pace that meant he had what he needed and was going to deliver it. "He knows," she said quietly. Henry followed her gaze to the empty spot where Briggs had been. "He knew when we walked out of Ede's office the first time this morning. Weston will have the details within the hour." She put her coffee cup down. "Then the 30 days starts now, whether Weston serves the notice today or waits. He'll wait at least a week to see if we flinch." Henry pulled out enough money to cover the meal and left it on the counter. "We're not going to flinch." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that steady, clear expression that she had learned over 4 days was not performance, was not the face he showed the world to manage it, was just him looking at her plainly, the way a person looked at someone they had decided mattered. She was going to have to deal with that list soon, the one she kept adding things to, the one that had started the morning she found the survey map and had been growing steadily ever since. She was going to have to sit down somewhere private and go through it, item by item, and decide what to do about the picture it was building. Not today. Today she had other things to manage, but soon. "Let's go home," Henry said. He had said it without thinking. She could tell the word. Home had simply emerged, applied to the ranch which was his home, and had been her place of employment, and which was she recognized with a clarity that was almost physical, the place she felt most like herself, in a way she hadn't felt anywhere since the rented room above the feed store, and the letter in her father's coat pocket, and the life that had ended, and then slowly, carefully across 3 years of someone else's floors, begun again. She did not correct him. "Let's go home," she said. And they walked back to the wagon in the Saturday morning light, and Millhaven moved around them, and somewhere behind a closed door, Gerald Weston was reading a message that was about to change his calculations entirely, and none of that was finished, not by a long distance, but it had begun finally, and irrevocably begun, and beginning was what her father had always said was the hardest part. He was right. He usually was. She had just needed 37 months to find the door. He had needed 37 months to find the door, and now that it was open, what stood on the other side of it was nothing like what either of them had expected, because the door opened not into resolution, but into the most dangerous 2 weeks of Margaret Holt's life. The first sign came Sunday morning before the filing had even reached Carver's docket. Dutch found it when he went out to check the north fence at dawn, a notice nailed to the Sullivan Ranch gate post, printed on formal bank letterhead, advising Henry Sullivan that the Millhaven Territorial Bank had initiated a review of outstanding credit obligations associated with the Sullivan property, and that all parties were required to present themselves at the bank no later than the following Friday for account reconciliation. It was signed by the bank's vice president, a man named Collier, who had been Dutch noted with the flat economy of a man who had seen a lot at Gerald Weston's dinner table 3 weeks prior. Dutch brought the notice to the kitchen and set it in front of Henry without a word. Henry read it, passed it to Margaret. Margaret read it twice because the first time she read it, she was looking for the legal mechanism, and the second time she was looking for what Weston was actually doing, and those were 2 different readings of the same document. "He's not calling the lien," she said. "This is a review, a fishing expedition. He wants to see what else is on your books that he can use. He already knows what's on my books. He's known for 20 years. He knows what was on them. He wants to know what's changed." She set the notice down. "He knows the filing is coming Monday. He's trying to establish financial leverage before Carver sees anything. Dutch poured himself coffee and sat down at the table, which was not something he did in the kitchen when things were ordinary. He did it now because things were not ordinary, and because Dutch Malone was a man who understood when a situation required presence. "You want me to ride to any of the neighbors? Warn them Weston may be coming at them sideways to put pressure on Henry." Henry looked at him. Which neighbors would listen? Dutch considered this with genuine seriousness. Halverson would. Peterson maybe if you talk to him direct. The rest. He tipped his hand. The rest have been inside Weston's orbit too long to move fast. Margaret was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Weston's strategy was becoming clearer to her the longer she looked at it. He could not attack the survey map directly. The document was genuine, and he knew it. He could not discredit her standing as heir. She had the documentation to establish it. What he could do was make the process so costly, so socially and financially exhausting, that they chose to stop before the court heard the case. He would squeeze Henry on the financial side, squeeze her on the credibility side, and squeeze everyone around them on the loyalty side. And he would do it simultaneously, and he would do it fast enough that responding to one front meant losing ground on another. It was a good strategy. She had expected something like it. What she had not fully calculated was how much it would cost to fight it while simultaneously preparing for the hearing. "We need help," she said. Henry looked at her. Dutch looked at her. "Not legal help. Edie has that. We need people in this territory who have standing, who are not inside Weston's orbit, and who understand what's actually happening." She turned to Dutch. "The families. The other 3 families from the scheme. Where are they?" Dutch straightened slightly. "The Calder family moved to Wyoming. The Prestons are still in the territory. They've got a small place outside Red Rock renting land that should be theirs." He paused. "The Beaumonts. Old Thomas Beaumont still lives in Denton. His son runs a hardware store there. Thomas Beaumont is alive, 71 years old and sharp as a new nail." Dutch's expression was the closest thing to satisfaction she had ever seen on it. "He's been waiting for someone to tell him he wasn't crazy for 20 years. Margaret looked at Henry. "We need Thomas Beaumont in Carver's courtroom. We need the Prestons if they'll come. We need living witnesses to what happened. People who can stand up and say, 'This is what was done to us. This is the clause. This is how it worked.' The survey map proves my father's specific case. But 4 families prove a pattern. A pattern proves intent. And proving intent is what convicts Gerald Weston." Henry's expression had shifted into the clear, focused quality it got when he was deciding something. "Dutch." "Already thinking about the road to Denton," Dutch said. "Take Monday. I'll need you back Tuesday with an answer from Beaumont." Dutch stood, drained his coffee, put the cup in the sink, the way Margaret had always arranged for cups to go in the sink, and walked out the back door. She heard his boots cross the yard, and then the sound of him saddling his horse in the dark before full sunrise. Henry looked at the bank notice still on the table. Then he looked at her. "Friday. The bank wants us Friday. We'll be in front of Carver by Thursday if Ede gets his emergency hearing." She picked up the notice and folded it. "We go to the bank meeting. We bring Ede. We answer every question they ask truthfully, and we volunteer nothing. And we make sure Collier understands that any action taken against this property while a fraud claim is active in the territorial court will be documented as obstruction. Can we do that? Ede will know the exact language, but yes, the principle is sound." She set the notice down again. "Weston is moving fast because he's afraid, Henry. Men who aren't afraid don't send bank notices on a Sunday morning. They wait. They let you worry. The fact that he moved this fast tells us the filing landed harder than he expected." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you know all of this?" She looked at him. "All of what?" "The strategy, the legal maneuvering, the way you read what Weston is actually doing underneath what he says he's doing." He wasn't challenging her. He was asking genuinely, with the particular quality of attention she had learned meant he actually wanted to know. "Your father was a horse farmer. You came here as a housekeeper. Where does this come from?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother's brother was a lawyer in Cincinnati. When my mother was alive, we visited him in summers. I was 12, 13, 14. I sat in his office and read his books because it was either that or sit with the women and talk about fabric, and I had no opinion about fabric. A pause. He died when I was 16, but I had 4 summers of reading everything on his shelves: contracts, property law, fraud statutes, evidence standards. She looked at her hands. I didn't know at 12 that I'd need it, but it turns out you use what you have. Henry looked at her for a long moment. Your mother's brother would be proud of you too. She looked up at him. The morning light was coming up properly now, filling the kitchen with the particular quality of early September, and Henry Sullivan was looking at her the way she had been refusing to name for 4 days, and she was running out of road on which to keep refusing. We have a great deal of work to do, she said. We do. He did not look away. That's not an argument. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she opened the case file, and they went to work. Monday arrived with the weight of something that had been building a long time. E-Day filed the emergency hearing request at 9 in the morning. By noon, Weston's attorneys, 3 of them, from a firm in the territorial capital that charged fees. Margaret didn't want to calculate, had filed a counter-motion challenging the standing of the plaintiff, the provenance of the primary evidence, and the validity of the emergency designation. By 2 in the afternoon, Carver had read both filings and scheduled a preliminary hearing for Thursday at 10. Edie sent a messenger to the ranch with the news. Margaret read the note and felt the cold clarity sharpen again into something almost like momentum. Thursday. 4 days. She wrote back in the messenger's presence. Inform Mr. Ede that Thomas Beaumont of Denton may be available as a witness. Request he assess the value of Beaumont's testimony and advise on preparation. The messenger left. She went back to the table where she had spread every remaining document in the case file, and she began to build the argument. The way her uncle had taught her. Arguments were built not from the conclusion backward, but from the facts outward, letting the facts determine the shape of the thing rather than forcing them into a predetermined frame. Henry worked alongside her. He was not a lawyer and did not try to pretend otherwise, but he had a rancher's particular precision with numbers and records, and he caught 2 errors in the financial documentation that she had missed, small ones. The kind of thing Weston's attorneys would have used to create doubt, and corrected them. She noticed him doing it without fanfare and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. Tuesday morning, Dutch rode back from Denton. He came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands and an expression that told her before he said a word that Thomas Beaumont had said yes. He wants to come himself, Dutch said. Wouldn't let his son come in his place, he said. Dutch stopped. Something moved across his weathered face that was not quite emotion, but was adjacent to it. He said he's been waiting 20 years for someone to prove he wasn't a fool. He said he'd ride to Millhaven on foot if he had to. Margaret pressed her mouth together for a moment. Can he travel? 71 years old. Rode horses his whole life. He'll make Millhaven by Wednesday evening easy. Dutch looked at Henry. The Prestons are harder. They're outside Red Rock, which is a day and a half. And Martin Preston, the father, he's not well. But his daughter Ruth sent word back that she'd come. How old is Ruth Preston? 32. She was 12 when they lost the land. She remembers everything. Dutch paused. She said she's been wanting to say what she remembers in front of someone official since she was 12 years old. Henry looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. 2 witnesses. 2 living people who had survived what her father had not survived, who could stand in Carver's courtroom and speak the pattern into the record in their own words. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to be consequential. Get them both here, she said. Wednesday. Ede needs to meet them before Thursday morning. Tuesday afternoon brought the next blow, and it came from a direction she had partially anticipated but not fully prepared for. 3 of the largest ranchers in the territory. Men who had done business with Weston for decades, who had bought cattle from Henry's father and sold horses to Gerald Weston, and shared Sunday dinners with both, sent letters to Henry. Not hostile letters. Careful ones. Letters that expressed concern, that used words like stability and community, and the way things have worked here, that said between every line that they were watching which way this went, and that they were not yet convinced it was going to go the way Henry seemed to think it would, and that there might be consequences for relationships they had all valued if this proceeding created the kind of disruption that disrupted things for everyone. Henry read all 3 letters at the kitchen table. His face was completely still. Margaret read them after him. She understood them precisely. They were not threats. They were notifications of potential abandonment, which was a different kind of pressure, the kind designed to make a man feel isolated before the fight rather than during it. It was the social equivalent of Weston's bank notice. Make him feel alone. Make him calculate the cost of that loneliness against the cost of continuing. Halvorsen didn't send one, she said. Henry looked at the 3 letters. No. Dutch said Halvorsen would listen. He's an honest man. He's also a careful one. He'll wait to see how Thursday goes before he commits to anything. Henry set the letters down. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was not suppressing emotion, but organizing it. I've known these men my whole life. Caldwell delivered the eulogy at my father's funeral. I know. He's not a bad man. He's a man who's operated inside a system for 30 years and doesn't know how to imagine the system being different. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one. He looked at her. I'm not angry at them. I'm angry at what made it possible for them to write letters like this and believe they were being reasonable. He paused. That's a different kind of anger. She understood it. It was the same anger she had been living with for 5 years, the kind that was too large and too systemic to direct at any single person and too real to put down. The anger at the structure that made injustice comfortable for everyone it wasn't happening to. She put the 3 letters in a separate folder and labeled it clearly. If Weston's attorneys tried to introduce the social pressure campaign as evidence of community opposition to the filing, she wanted documentation of exactly when it started and what form it took. Wednesday brought Thomas Beaumont and Ruth Preston to Millhaven. Thomas Beaumont was exactly what Dutch had described, 71 years old, compact and straight-spined, with the particular quality of a man who had been angry about something for a very long time and had refined that anger into something precise and usable. He shook Margaret's hand in Edie's office and held it a moment longer than a handshake required, and looked at her with eyes that were very bright. Elias Holt's daughter, he said, not a question. Your father wrote me a letter in 1882, telling me he'd found a lawyer who believed him, asking if I'd give a deposition. He paused. The lawyer took his money and lost the motion in 60 days. I wrote your father back. He never answered. He died in March of that year, she said quietly. Beaumont nodded, held her hand one more second. Let go. Then this is for him too. Ruth Preston was different, younger, quieter, with the careful self-containment of someone who had learned early that her feelings were not always safe to display in public. She had ridden a day and a half on her own, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about Ruth Preston's determination. She sat in Ede's office and answered his questions in a clear, direct voice that did not waver, and she remembered as Dutch had said everything. The name of the lawyer her father had used, the exact wording of the clause, the date they had been told to leave, the way the territorial marshal had stood on their porch and told her father that the paperwork was in order and that there was nothing to be done. She was 12 years old when that happened. She was 32 now. She had been carrying the specific weight of that morning for 20 years. Ede listened to both of them and made notes, and then looked at Margaret with the expression of a lawyer who had just seen his case change shape. Pattern testimony from 2 additional plaintiffs, one of whom has personal recollection, and one of whom has documentary evidence from the period. He set his pen down. This changes Thursday materially. That's why I sent Dutch to Denton, she said. Ede almost smiled. I'm beginning to understand why it took Weston's operation 20 years and a dead lawyer to stay ahead of this. The Wednesday evening before the hearing was the hardest part, not for legal reasons. The case was as prepared as it was going to be. Ede had his argument. The witnesses were in Millhaven. The documents were certified, organized, and ready. There was nothing more to do with the preparation, and Margaret knew it, and the knowing of it left her with nowhere to put the energy that had been running her forward for 4 days. She sat on the hotel's back porch in the cool evening and did not think about the case. She thought about the 40 acres. She thought about the particular quality of the soil in the western parcel. Her father had described it to her so many times that she could feel it in her hands without having touched it in 15 years. Dark and deep and responsive. The kind of ground that gave back more than you put into it if you treated it right. Her father had wanted wheat. She had said wheat that morning in the hotel dining room before everything had accelerated into this. Wheat took time. Wheat required patience. Wheat was a crop for someone who believed in the future of the ground they were planting. She heard boots on the porch boards, the particular rhythm of them. Henry sat down beside her. Or not in the chair adjacent, on the same step, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you, I know." He was quiet for a moment, looking at whatever she was looking at, which was the dark beyond the porch. "I've been thinking about the lien." "What about it?" "If Carver rules in our favor, Thursday, and I think he will on the emergency designation at minimum, Weston's position weakens. The bank review loses its pressure if the fraud case has traction. Collier won't want to be associated with an obstruction finding." He paused. "But even if we win Thursday, and we win the full hearing, and the record gets corrected, and the land comes back, the lien is still a separate instrument. It's still a debt. The lien is challengeable. Ede thinks, I know what Ede thinks. I also know that challenging it adds another 6 months, and more cost, and more pressure, and more letters from men I've known my whole life telling me I'm disrupting things." He looked at her sideways. "I want to pay it, not because I think it's legitimate, because I want it gone. I want there to be nothing between you and those 40 acres that has my father's name on it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's $40,000. I know what it is. Henry, I have the money. The ranch has had good years. Not $40,000 on the table good years, but I can raise it against the livestock and the equipment without touching the land." He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without drama or performance. "I want to do this." She turned to look at him directly. He was looking straight at her, the way he had been looking at her for 4 days, with that expression she had finally named somewhere around Tuesday morning and had been carrying the name of without knowing what to do with it. "That's not your debt to pay," she said. "My family incurred it." "You didn't." "Margaret." He said her name the way he had started saying it, plainly, with the particular weight of someone using a word they mean to stand behind. "I know you're capable of handling this alone. I know you came here alone and searched alone and found the evidence alone, and I know you would walk into that courtroom alone tomorrow if you had to, and you would probably still win. That's not what this is." She waited. "This is me telling you that I don't want you to have to do this alone. Not because you can't, because you've been alone with it for 5 years, and that's long enough." He paused. "And because—" Another pause shorter. "Because I want to be on the same side of this as you. Not as a lawyer or an ally or a strategic partner. As the person who—" He stopped. She understood what he had stopped before. She understood it precisely because she had been stopped before the same sentence herself for 4 days, adding things to a list that had become, in the privacy of her own thinking, too long to keep calling a list. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The biscuits." He blinked. "What? You said I never made extra. In 3 years I made exactly the right amount every morning. But Wednesday the morning, everything changed. I made the same amount I always made, which was enough for both of us." She held his gaze. "I made 12 biscuits for a kitchen where I thought I was going to be alone by noon. I didn't think about it. My hands just did it." She paused. "I've been thinking about what that means." He was very still. "I think," she said carefully, "that some part of me had already decided something about this house and this kitchen and this ranch. Before I was ready to know, I'd decided it." She paused. "That's a complicated thing to sit with when you came here for a specific purpose, and falling into feelings was not part of the plan." "No," he said. "I don't suppose it was. I'm not a woman who does things without a plan." "I know. I'm also not a woman who lies to herself when the evidence is clear." She looked at him. The porch was very quiet around them. Inside the hotel, she could hear the distant sound of someone playing a piano badly, which was oddly appropriate for this moment. The evidence has been getting clearer since Wednesday morning. Henry reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not urgently, not possessively. With the same steady, deliberate quality that characterized everything he did, a choice made clearly and held without apology. She let him hold it. Let herself feel the warmth of it, the solid weight of a hand that had spent its life doing real work on real ground. "The land comes back first," she said. "Yes. Everything else after. That's a reasonable sequence." She looked out at the dark beyond the porch. Wheat country, if you knew how to read it. Her father's ground 2 days' ride from here, waiting the same patient way it had been waiting for 37 months. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. He did not let go of her hand, and she did not take it back, and the cool September evening moved around them, and inside the hotel, someone stopped playing the piano badly, and the quiet that followed was the kind that felt complete. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. They were in Ede's office at 8. Thomas Beaumont was already there, sitting straight in his chair with his hands on his knees, and the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular appointment and intends to keep it properly. Ruth Preston sat beside him, her documents in a folder on her lap, her back straight, her face composed in the way of someone who had decided this morning mattered and was not going to let it see her rattled. Ede went through the sequence one final time. Margaret listened and did not interrupt. Henry sat beside her and was present in the particular way that had become familiar to her, not drawing attention to himself, not inserting himself, just there, solid and reliable as the ranch posts he had been setting since he was old enough to work. At 9:40 they walked across the street to the courthouse. Weston was already there. He sat at the respondent's table with 3 attorneys in expensive suits, and the particular quality of a man who had been in courtrooms before and believed they would resolve as they usually did in his favor. He looked at Margaret when she came through the door, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away for a moment, and then she sat down at the plaintiff's table and put the case file on the surface in front of her and opened it to the survey map. His attorneys looked at it. She saw one of them lean to another and say something. She could not hear what it was. She did not need to. Carver came in at 10 exactly. He was younger than she had imagined, mid-40s, precise-looking, with the efficient manner of a man who ran his courtroom, the way she ran a study, everything in its proper place, and nothing wasted. He read the filings, both sets. He took 14 minutes, which was thorough, without being theatrical. Then he looked up. "This court will hear the emergency designation request first. Plaintiff's counsel, you will establish the basis for imminent threat." Ede stood. He had the bearing of a man who had prepared so completely that the preparation had become invisible, which was the only way to do it. He laid out the bank notice. He laid out the lien. He laid out the timeline filing, Saturday bank notice, Sunday Weston's appearance on the street Wednesday. He made the pattern clear without editorializing, because the pattern was clear enough that editorializing would only have weakened it. Weston's lead attorney stood to respond and used a great many words to say that a bank conducting a routine account review was not evidence of anything except responsible financial management, and that the existing lien was a legitimate instrument recorded years before any dispute arose, and that characterizing standard business practice as intimidation was itself an attempt to prejudice the court. Carver listened to all of it, made a note. Then he looked at the plaintiff's table, and his eyes moved to Margaret specifically. "Miss Holt, you are the primary plaintiff in this filing." She stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "You were present in the Sullivan household for 3 years prior to this filing." "Yes, Your Honor." "In what capacity?" "Housekeeper." "In practice also in the capacity of an heir conducting a search for evidence of a fraud committed against her father's estate." A murmur in the courtroom. Carver did not respond to it except by letting it settle. "And the primary evidence, the survey map, was located on the Sullivan property during that time." "Yes, Your Honor. Hidden beneath a floorboard in the residence in oilcloth wrapping by the late Robert Sullivan. Henry Sullivan was unaware of its location." Carver looked at Henry. "Mr. Sullivan, you are cooperating with this filing." Henry stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My father committed a wrong. I intend to help correct it. Carver made another note. He was the kind of judge who noted things that mattered and did not note things that didn't, which told her a great deal about him. Then Weston's lead attorney stood again, and what he said next was the thing she had been waiting for and dreading and preparing for in equal measure. He said it cleanly and without apparent malice, which made it worse. Your Honor, the plaintiff's presence in the Sullivan household constitutes a deliberate pattern of deception. She misrepresented her purpose for employment. She accessed private areas of the property under false pretenses. The evidence she retrieved was obtained through a sustained fraudulent misrepresentation of her own identity and intentions. Any document recovered through such means. The document was not obtained through fraud, Eade said on his feet. The document was created in 1874 by Robert Sullivan and witnessed by himself as acknowledgement of a paid encumbrance. Its validity is independent of where it was stored and who located it. The plaintiff's presence in the household is relevant to credibility, not to the document's legal standing. The plaintiff used her position. The plaintiff used her intelligence, Eade said. She searched for evidence of a crime committed against her father. She found it. The law does not require victims to be passive. Carver held up a hand. Both attorneys went quiet. He looked at the survey map copy that Eade had submitted to the court. He looked at it for a long moment. The emergency designation is granted, he said. The existing lien on the Sullivan property is stayed pending resolution of the primary fraud claim. Any financial action taken against the Sullivan property during the pendency of this case will be reviewed by this court as potential interference with judicial proceedings. He looked directly at Weston's table. That stay applies to all parties and all related institutions. Weston's lead attorney's face did not change. The man beside him wrote something on a notepad very quickly. Weston himself looked at Margaret. He was very still, and his expression had finally shed the patient, amused quality it had worn since the street outside the bank. What was underneath it was something older and harder and more honest, and she looked at it without flinching. She had been looking at things like it for 5 years. Carver set the date for the full hearing 3 weeks out, which was fast. He instructed both parties to submit complete witness lists and evidence indexes within 5 days. He adjourned the preliminary session with the brisk efficiency of a man who had another case at 2 and was not going to let this one make him late. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Thomas Beaumont put his hand on her shoulder briefly, a gesture that required no words and received none. Ruth Preston stood straight and still and looked at the courthouse door and then back at Margaret and said very quietly, "My father will want to hear about today." "Tell him it's not finished yet," Margaret said. "But tell him we're winning." Ruth nodded. Something in her carefully composed face shifted just for a moment, just enough to let through the 20 years of weight behind it. And then she composed it again and went to find Dutch, who had promised her a meal before the road back to Red Rock. Henry came and stood beside Margaret. Eade was behind them, already talking to his associates about the witness list. She looked at the courthouse door. At the institutional wood and glass of it, ordinary, unremarkable, the door of a building that sat in the middle of an ordinary territorial town and processed ordinary territorial disputes. Behind that door 20 minutes ago, something had shifted. Not finished, not resolved, but shifted. "He's going to fight the full hearing hard," she said. "I know. He has 3 weeks to find something we've missed. Then we spend 3 weeks making sure there's nothing to find." She turned to look at him. I was looking at her with the clear, steady expression that she had named on Tuesday and had been carrying since. In the courthouse hallway, with Eade's associates moving around them and the sound of the court's ordinary business continuing through closed doors. He looked at her the way she had been looked at by very few people in her life, completely as if she were a thing worth seeing entirely. "We go back to the ranch," he said. "We work the witness list. We prepare for the full hearing. And somewhere in the middle of all of that," he paused, "we plant wheat." She looked at him. "It's September. Too late for a fall planting." "Then we prepare the ground now. Get it ready. Plant in spring." She understood him. He was not talking about wheat. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Spring is a reasonable timeline." He held out his hand. She took it. In the ordinary hallway of the Millhaven courthouse, with everything still unfinished and everything that mattered already begun, Margaret Holt, who had come to a man's house as a housekeeper and found what she came for and a great deal more, besides, walked back out into the September morning with her hand in Henry Sullivan's, and 3 weeks of the hardest fight still ahead. And for the first time in 37 months, she was not walking alone. And for the first time in 37 months, she was not walking alone. But alone was exactly what Weston intended to make her feel before the 3 weeks were finished, because the morning after the preliminary hearing, the Millhaven Courier ran a story on the front page that had nothing to do with land fraud and everything to do with Margaret Holt. The headline read, "Housekeeper or Spy Questions Surround Sullivan Land Claim." She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold. Henry read it standing behind her, one hand on the back of her chair, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the tension move through him as he read. The article did not use the word liar. It did not need to. It used phrases like questions of motive and unorthodox means of evidence collection and sources close to the Sullivan family who wished to remain anonymous. And in between those careful phrases, it constructed a picture of a woman who had entered a respected man's household under false pretenses, cultivated his trust, and used her intimate access to his private papers to build a legal case that conveniently served her financial interests. It was well written. That was the most alarming thing about it. Weston had not hired someone careless to do this. "Anonymous sources," Henry said. His voice was controlled, just barely. "One of the 3 ranchers who sent letters, or someone on their staff." She folded the paper in half so she didn't have to look at it. "It doesn't matter who, it matters what people read. People in this territory know me. People in this territory knew your father too." She said it gently but clearly because it was true, and they both knew it, and leaving it unsaid would not make it less true. The article isn't aimed at people who know you well. It's aimed at people who know you well enough to have an opinion about your judgment. It's trying to make them wonder whether you've been managed by a clever woman. Henry was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone completely flat. "If any man in this territory believes I've been managed by anyone, then we show them otherwise." She stood up. "We don't respond to the article directly. Responding gives it weight. What we do is make sure that by the time the full hearing arrives, every person in this territory who matters has seen Thomas Beaumont stand up in a courtroom and say what was done to him, and Ruth Preston, and every document in that case file." She looked at him. "The story about me is designed to be louder than the story about the fraud. We make the fraud louder." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "I'm going to see Halverson." She blinked. "Now?" "He didn't send a letter. Dutch said he'd listen. If I go to him directly today before Weston has time to work on him through other channels." He turned to look at her. "Halverson has 700 acres and 20 years of standing in this territory. If he comes to that hearing, other people follow." She thought about it. It was not the move she would have made. Not instinctively, she was built for document work, for legal architecture, for the kind of fight that happened on paper. But Henry was built for something different, for the direct human approach, for looking a man in the eye and saying the true thing plainly, and trusting that truth had weight. She had seen him do it. She had seen it work. "Go," she said. "Be back by evening. Ede is sending the witness list draft by messenger, and I need you to review it." He nodded and went out. She heard the horse leave the yard. Then she sat back down with the folded newspaper and the cold coffee and the case file, and she went back to work. The 3 weeks did not soften. They accelerated. By the end of the first week, 2 things had happened that Ede had not predicted, and Margaret had half expected. The first was that the Millhaven Territorial Bank, presumably instructed by Weston through Collier, formally suspended the account review, which meant the stay Carver had issued was working, and Weston had calculated that pressing on the financial front, while the court's eye was directly on him, was too expensive. That was good. The second thing was that a man named James Aldrich arrived in Millhaven, the son of the dead lawyer. Young 30 maybe, with his father's papers in a satchel, and an expression of someone who had been carrying something uncomfortable for a long time and had finally decided to set it down. He came to Ede's office. Ede sent for Margaret immediately. She sat across from James Aldrich in Ede's office and looked at a man who was clearly frightened and clearly determined in equal measure, which was a combination she recognized intimately. "My father kept copies," Aldrich said. His hands were steady, but his voice had a slight roughness to it, the way voices got when a person was managing more than they showed. "He kept copies of everything. I found them after he died in a locked box in his study. I didn't know what they were at first. It took me a year to understand what I was looking at." "What are they?" Ede's voice was careful. Aldrich opened the satchel. "The original draft contracts, with Weston's handwriting on them." He set a folder on the desk. "Gerald Weston drafted the fraudulent clause himself, in his own hand. My father's copies show the revision history, the clean version that was presented to the families, and the working drafts with Weston's annotations." The room was completely silent. Margaret looked at the folder, then she looked at Ede. Ede looked at the folder with the expression of a man who had just been handed something he had not expected and was assessing it with great care before he allowed himself to feel anything about it. "Why are you bringing this now?" she asked Aldrich. He looked at her directly. "Because I read the filing. I saw your father's name." A pause. "My father wasn't a good man. I've known that for a long time. He took money to do things that hurt people. I can't undo that, and I can't apologize for it adequately." He paused again. "But I can make sure the record shows who actually designed it." Ede picked up the folder, opened it, read the first page. His expression did not change, but she had learned to read the stillness behind his expressions, and what she saw there was controlled elation, the particular feeling of a lawyer who has just watched a case go from strong to irrefutable. "This is Weston's handwriting." Ede's voice was completely level. "I have 3 letters in his hand from the same period for comparison. Business correspondence my father kept." Aldrich reached back into the satchel. "You can verify them." Margaret sat back in her chair. She was thinking about Gerald Weston, standing on the main street of Millhaven, with his smooth manner and his patient smile, and his carefully maintained position of being always one remove from the actual wrongdoing. The witness, the facilitator, the man who never signed anything he couldn't explain away. Except he had signed these, or rather, he had written on them, in his own hand. Working drafts with his annotations showing the evolution of the fraudulent clause from concept to final language. He had kept them because her father had kept the survey map, and Robert Sullivan had kept the financial records because men who built systems of control believed at some fundamental level that the control would hold, that the papers would never surface, that the people they had damaged were too poor, too tired, too beaten down to come looking 20 years later with a lawyer and a case file and a room full of witnesses. He had been almost right. Almost. "We amend the filing," she said. "Tomorrow morning." Ede agreed. The amended filing landed in Carver's courtroom on a Wednesday 12 days before the hearing. Weston's attorneys requested an emergency session to challenge the new evidence. Carver granted it same day 2 in the afternoon. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table and watched Weston's lead attorney argue that the Aldrich documents were inadmissible hearsay, unverified, potentially fabricated, the self-serving production of a disgruntled son, attempting to rehabilitate a deceased father's reputation at a convenient moment. He was persuasive. She had stopped underestimating how persuasive he was after the first session. Ede responded by producing the 3 handwriting comparison letters and requesting that the court appoint a document examiner to verify the samples. He had already located the examiner, a retired territorial court clerk who had served for 30 years and whose qualifications were not challengeable. Carver appointed him on the spot and gave him 5 days. 5 days. The hearing was in 12. She counted backwards from the hearing date every morning when she woke up. 11 days. 10. 9. The examiner worked. Weston's attorneys filed 2 more motions. One challenging the standing of James Aldrich as a voluntary witness. One attempting to exclude Thomas Beaumont's testimony on grounds of relevance. Carver denied both with the efficient brevity of a judge who had read everything submitted and found the arguments insufficient. 8 days. 7. On the 6th day before the hearing, Henry came back from a second visit to Halverson's ranch with news that made Margaret set down her coffee cup and be completely still for a moment. "He's coming to the hearing," Henry said, "and he's bringing Peterson." She looked at him. "Peterson sent a letter." Peterson reconsidered. Halverson can be very direct when he believes in something. Henry sat down across from her. "And Caldwell." Caldwell wrote the most carefully worded letter of the three. "Caldwell came to me yesterday, came here to the ranch. I didn't tell you because I wanted to know what he said before I decided what it meant." Henry looked at his hands for a moment. "He told me he knew. Not everything, not the scope of it, not the judge, not Weston's involvement. But he knew the land agreements were not what they appeared to be. He knew some of the families had been treated wrongly." The kitchen was very quiet. "And he said nothing," Margaret said. "He said nothing. For 20 years. Henry's voice was careful and controlled the way it was when he was managing something large. "He told me he was ashamed. He didn't use that word, but that's what it was. He said he didn't know how to step into something that was already finished, that he told himself the families had moved on, that disturbing it would only cause more harm." He looked up. "He wants to testify." "To what?" "To the fact that there was common knowledge in the ranching community that Robert Sullivan and Gerald Weston operated in ways that weren't clean, that people knew and looked away." He held her gaze. "He said that someone needs to say it out loud, that looking away is its own kind of complicity, and he'd rather say so in a courtroom than spend another 20 years knowing he didn't." Margaret absorbed this for a long moment. She thought about the architecture of what Weston had built, not just the legal fraud, not just the financial mechanism, but the social structure that had held it all in place. The way men like Caldwell had let it stand, because stepping into it was costly and uncomfortable, and the people being hurt were not in their immediate circle. She had been angry at that structure for 5 years. She was still angry at it. But Caldwell coming to this ranch and asking to stand up in a courtroom and name his own complicity was something she had not expected, and it shifted things. "Add him to the witness list," she said. "Tell Edie to prepare him carefully." Henry nodded. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way he had been doing with increasing naturalness over the past 2 weeks. Not dramatically, not as a performance, just as a fact. She let her hand turn under his and hold back. 5 more days, she said. 5 more days. The document examiner delivered his findings on the 4th day before the hearing. The handwriting in the annotated draft contracts matched Gerald Weston's hand in the comparison letters to a degree of certainty he rated at 96%. He submitted a 12-page report with specific comparisons annotated. Weston's attorneys filed one more motion. Carver denied it in 6 hours. That evening, Margaret sat on the ranch porch. Her porch, she had started thinking of it that way without deciding to, and tried to be calm about what was coming. She was not entirely successful. She was a practical woman, and she understood the difference between a strong case and a guaranteed outcome. And she understood that courtrooms had produced wrong results for her family before under conditions that had seemed from the outside equally clear-cut. But those courtrooms had been bought. This one, as far as anyone could determine, was not. She was still sitting there when Dutch came out and sat on the step below her and was quiet for a while, in the way Dutch was quiet fully without apology. "You know what I remember about your father," Dutch said eventually. She looked at him. "You said you knew him some. From the summer market in Denton. 3-4 summers I saw him there. He had a particular way with horses, real patient. He never hurried them, and they gave him everything for it." Dutch turned his hat in his hands. "He came to the market the summer before the trouble started, and he had a colt with him that was barely broke. That colt was a handful. Half the buyers walked away. Your father just stood there and waited, and the colt settled, and he sold it for a fair price to a man who could see what it was." A pause. "Patient. He was the most patient man I ever watched work." Margaret was quiet. "You've got some of that," Dutch said. "The patience. 3 years in this house, that's not something a person does unless they're built for it." He stood up, which meant he was finished saying what he had come to say. "Hey, you'll be all right Tuesday." I went back inside. She sat with what he'd said, and the particular quality of the evening around her, and she let herself feel for the first time in 5 years, something that was not strategy or endurance or controlled forward motion, but something softer and more unguarded than any of those things. She let herself feel almost certain that it was going to be all right. Tuesday arrived the way consequential days arrived, ordinary on the outside, enormous underneath. She wore her best dress, which was not extravagant, but was clean and well-made, and hers. Henry wore his good suit, which she had seen him in exactly once before. Dutch drove them to Millhaven in the wagon, and did not speak on the road, which was exactly right. The courthouse was more full than it had been for the preliminary hearing. Word had traveled in the particular way that important things traveled in small territories, ahead of any formal announcement carried by the specific gravity of something people sensed mattered. Halverson was there. Peterson was there. Caldwell was in the third row with his hat on his knee and an expression of a man who had not slept well and was here anyway. Thomas Beaumont was in the front of the gallery with his straight spine and his bright eyes. Ruth Preston sat beside him, her folder of documents in her lap. James Aldrich was near the back, quiet, and she caught his eye when she came in and nodded once, and he nodded back. Weston sat at the respondents' table. He looked for the first time like a man who understood that the room had changed around him. His 3 attorneys were there, and they were still formidable. But something in the quality of Weston's stillness was different from what it had been in the preliminary hearing. It was denser, more internal. The stillness of a man who was calculating very fast and finding the numbers increasingly difficult. Carver came in. The room settled. The hearing ran 6 hours. Edie led. He was extraordinarily methodical and precise, building the case the way it had been built from the beginning, from the facts outward. The survey map. The original contract. The fraudulent clause in Robert Sullivan's language and Gerald Weston's handwriting. The financial records of judicial corruption. The pattern across 4 families and 12 years. Then the witnesses. Thomas Beaumont took the stand and spoke for 40 minutes. His voice did not shake once. He described the morning in 1878 when the territorial marshal had come to tell him the land agreement had been enforced, and the western parcel of his family's property was no longer his. He described the clause that had been misrepresented to him. He named what he had lost. He was specific and clear and completely without self-pity, which was more devastating than self-pity would have been. Weston's lead attorney cross-examined him for 20 minutes, trying various angles, and Thomas Beaumont answered every question with the patient, precise authority of a man who had been waiting 20 years for someone to ask and was not going to be rattled now. Ruth Preston testified about what she had seen at 12 years old and what she had remembered for 20. She was quieter than Beaumont, but no less clear, and when Weston's attorney attempted to suggest that a 12-year-old's memory was unreliable, she looked at him and said, "The morning your family is told to leave the land your father farmed his whole life is not a morning a person forgets." Carver did not allow the follow-up question. Caldwell testified last before James Aldrich. He sat in the witness chair and looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked at the court and told the truth. He said that among the established ranching community, there had been awareness over many years that Sullivan and Weston operated in ways that were not clean. He said that he had known and had not acted. He said that was a failure of character he was naming here because he was not willing to let the people who had been harmed also bear the cost of everyone else's silence. He did not look at Henry while he said it. He looked at Margaret. She held his gaze steadily and gave him nothing except her full attention, which was what the moment required. James Aldrich took the stand and identified the documents in his father's hand. He walked the court through the revision history of the fraudulent clause. He was calm in the way of someone who had made a difficult decision and was on the other side of it. Weston's attorneys fought every piece. They were skilled, and they were thorough, and they made every argument available to them. Some of the arguments were good ones. None of them was good enough to overcome 96% handwriting certainty and 4 living witnesses and 20 years of documented pattern. At 4:15 in the afternoon, Carver called a recess. At 5:40, he came back. The courtroom was so quiet, Margaret could hear the person 2 seats behind her breathing. Carver looked at his notes, then he looked at the courtroom. The court finds that the documentary evidence submitted by the plaintiff establishes to the requisite standard that the land transfer agreements executed between Robert Sullivan and the plaintiff families in the period 1876 through 1888 contained fraudulent misrepresentations material to the agreement's validity. He paused. The court further finds that Gerald Weston participated in the design and execution of those fraudulent instruments as a primary architect, not merely as a peripheral party. Weston's lead attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor." "Sit down, counselor." Carver's voice did not raise. It did not need to. "The fraudulent agreements are hereby voided. The land transfers executed under those agreements are reversed. The affected parcels revert to the original owners or their surviving heirs. The transfer to be completed through the Territorial Land Office within 30 days. He looked at the plaintiff's table. The lien on the Sullivan property drawn up and executed during the same period by the same parties is found to be a related instrument of the same fraudulent scheme and is void and unenforceable. She heard Dutch exhale somewhere behind her. Regarding the criminal referral, this court will forward the record of proceedings to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office, with a recommendation that Gerald Weston be investigated for fraud, conspiracy, and corruption of a judicial officer. Carver looked at Weston directly. "Mr. Weston, you are advised to remain available to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office." Weston sat completely still. He was looking at the surface of the respondent's table. He did not look up. Carver adjourned at 5:53. The courtroom did not immediately erupt. It took a moment, the particular stunned moment that follows something large when everyone in the room is processing the size of what just happened. And then Thomas Beaumont stood up, and he was not the kind of man who made noise easily, but the sound he made was not a shout and not a cry, and was the most human sound she had heard in 5 years. And Ruth Preston put both hands over her face, and Dutch said something in a language she didn't know, and Henry was beside her suddenly, solidly, and she was standing, and she was holding the edge of the plaintiff's table, and she was looking at the place where Carver had been sitting, and the fact of what had just happened was landing in her in pieces, each piece requiring its own moment. Ede appeared at her elbow. "Margaret." She turned to look at him. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "Your father's land comes home," he said simply. She pressed her mouth together. Held it. Let the feeling move through her. The way large feelings needed to move. Not suppressed, not performed, just felt fully and privately, even in a public room. Henry put his hand on her back. Not saying anything. Just there. She found her voice. "The 30 days for the land transfer. I want to be present at the land office when they process it." "Of course," Ede said. "And I want the record corrected in the Millhaven Courier, the same front page they used." "I'll draft the letter tonight." She nodded. She turned and looked for James Aldrich and found him near the back of the courtroom, standing with his hat in his hands and an expression of someone who had just put something down that had been very heavy. She crossed the room to him. He looked up when she approached. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "I should have come sooner." "You came." She looked at him steadily. That's what mattered. Outside the courthouse, the September evening had gone gold and long, the light of late afternoon lying across Millhaven's Main Street, with the particular quality of a day that had been important and knew it. Thomas Beaumont shook Henry's hand for a long time and said something to him quietly that she did not hear and did not need to. Ruth Preston stood with Dutch, who was telling her something that was making her smile for the first time since Margaret had met her. Halvorsen found Henry and Margaret together and shook both their hands and said with the directness of a man who did not waste words, "Your father would have done the same thing, Henry, if he'd known sooner." He paused. "I should have told him sooner. That's on me." Henry looked at him. "It's done now, Earl." Halvorsen nodded once. Left. Caldwell came last. He stood in front of Margaret and did not offer his hand, which she understood he was not asking for absolution, just the opportunity to stand in front of the person most directly harmed and be seen clearly. She looked at him clearly, which was what he needed, and after a moment, he nodded and walked away. She and Henry stood on the courthouse steps as the evening settled in and the crowd dispersed, and Millhaven gradually resumed its ordinary pace, around what had been for the last 6 hours an extraordinary afternoon. "The land office opens at 8 tomorrow," she said. "I'll be there." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had named and kept and had been building a future around for 3 weeks. The evening light was on his face. He looked like what he was, a man who had inherited a wrong and chosen to correct it, who had stood in a courtroom and said plainly that his family had done harm and that harm needed undoing, who had held her hand on a hotel porch and talked about spring planting and meant something larger than planting by it. "I owe you an answer," she said. He looked at her. "To what question?" "To the one you haven't asked yet." She held his gaze steadily. "You've been patient. Like my father with the horses, you didn't hurry it. You let it settle." A pause. "It's settled." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Margaret Holt, Elias Holt's daughter, the woman who spent 3 years in my house looking for a piece of paper and found it and fought for it and won." He paused. "Would you stay? Not as a housekeeper." They both understood that without it being said. She thought about the 40 acres. The soil her father had described so many times she could feel it. The wheat that would go in spring, the first crop on land that was finally, irrevocably, legally hers. She thought about the ranch kitchen she had organized in her second week and never changed. About Dutch and his coffee, and his particular quality of steady presence. About the wagon road to Millhaven, and the courthouse steps, and the letter her father had written that had started all of this. The letter signed Elias Holt in the careful hand of a man who needed to be clearly himself, even when everything around him was being taken. She thought about what it meant to stay somewhere, not because you had to, not because you were hiding or searching or surviving, but because you had chosen it. Because the ground under it was honest, and the people on it were worth the choosing, and the life it offered was one you had earned the right to want. "Yes," she said. Henry looked at her. Something in him settled. She could see it the same way you could see a horse settle when it finally trusted the ground under it. I didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked off the courthouse steps and into the Millhaven evening, and the 40 acres were waiting, and the spring was coming, and Elias Holt's daughter had come as a housekeeper and found the truth and reclaimed the land and chosen finally and freely to plant something that would last. Some debts take 37 months to collect. Some roots take a whole life to find the right ground. And some women walk through 3 years of someone else's house carrying everything they love in silence, and come out the other side with the deed, the truth, and the life they were always meant to have.